There is a particular kind of soldier the 20th century produced, one who existed at the precise intersection of sea and land, who trained to cross open water under fire and take ground that nature and an enemy had conspired to make impassable. Most wars are decided in the interior, in the sweep of armies across plains and through forests, along roads and rivers that armies have always followed. But a different kind of war was fought across the Pacific Ocean in the first half of that century. A war measured not in kilometers of open ground, but in meters of coral, in the width of a beach, in the depth of a bunker, carved into an atoll that most maps did not bother to name. This is the story of the men who built that war, and the men who were consumed by it. The Imperial Japanese Naval Landing Forces, known to their own people as the Rikusentai, known to their enemies by reputation long before they were known by name, were among the most formidable amphibious fighters the world had ever seen. They were not, in the beginning, celebrated. They were debated. They were underfunded. They were caught between two great institutional powers, the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy, each of which regarded the other with a suspicion that sometimes bordered on open contempt. For years, the very question of whether Japan needed dedicated naval infantry was treated as a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than a strategic necessity. History answered that question in fire. From the narrow streets of Shanghai in the early 1930s to the coral beaches of the Central Pacific, a decade later, the men of the Special Naval Landing Forces carved a record that runs the full length of human experience in war, from swift and seemingly effortless conquest to slow, grinding, inevitable destruction. They seized islands in hours. They held islands for days against forces 10 times their size. They built fortresses on specks of land so small that the tide nearly covered them, and they fought inside those fortresses until there was almost no one left to fight. And then the tide came in and did not go out. What follows is the complete history, from the very beginning to the very end. If you have settled in for a long night, you have chosen well. This story does not rush. It does not skip the difficult parts or linger only on the dramatic ones. It moves the way history actually moves, sometimes with terrifying speed, sometimes with the slow, grinding weight of forces that no individual human being could have stopped. There will be moments of genuine brilliance in here, of tactical ingenuity and physical courage that deserves to be recorded honestly. There will also be moments of catastrophic failure, of institutional arrogance, of men sent to die on islands the High Command had already privately given up on. We will not look away from either kind. Before we begin, if this is your first time finding this channel, welcome. We make these long-form documentaries specifically for the kind of audience that wants the full picture, not the highlight reel. If you appreciate that approach, take a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means these stories keep getting made. And if you are watching this at the end of a long day, or late into the night with the lights turned low, then settle in, get comfortable, let the story come to you. This is exactly what this documentary was made for. Now, the Pacific Ocean covers roughly 1/3 of the entire surface of the Earth. It contains more than 25,000 islands, ranging from the continental mass of Australia to coral formations barely large enough to park a motor vehicle. In the 19th century, the great European powers, Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, had moved through this ocean systematically, planting flags on islands that indigenous peoples had inhabited for thousands of years, and calling the act civilization. By the time Japan began its own imperial expansion in the late 1800s, the map of the Pacific was already crowded with European claims. Japan looked at that map and saw not a completed puzzle, but an unfinished one. and it began, methodically and deliberately, to acquire the pieces it believed it needed. That acquisition required a military instrument that Japan did not yet have. Land armies could march across continents. Naval vessels could control sea lanes and bombard coastlines. But the work of taking an island, of crossing open water in small craft under fire, of hitting a beach with enough force to break whatever was waiting on the other side, of holding ground that could only be reinforced by sea, that required something different, something specialized, something that most military establishments of the early 20th century had not yet fully worked out how to build. Japan looked west, as it had looked west for much of the Meiji era, and it studied. It studied the United States Marines. It studied the British Royal Marines. It read the after-action reports. It sent observers. It commissioned analyses. And then it did what Japan had done with Western models throughout the Meiji period. It took what was useful, discarded what did not fit, and built something distinctly its own. What it built was the Rikusentai. The word itself does not translate cleanly. It means something like Naval Land Combat Unit, a name that captures the institutional tension at the heart of the force. These were sailors trained to fight on land. They belonged to the Navy, but operated on Army terrain. They were neither fish nor fowl by the conventions of military organization, and that ambiguity followed them for their entire existence as a fighting force. It created problems. It created gaps in supply chains and command authority. It created moments where two Japanese services that should have been coordinating were instead competing, sometimes at the cost of the men on the ground. But it also created something else. It created an identity, a fierce, particular, almost tribal sense of belonging that set the Rikusentai apart from every other formation in the Japanese military. They trained harder, by deliberate design, than almost any other unit Japan produced. They were conditioned to regard physical hardship not as an obstacle, but as proof. They were taught, not merely told, but taught, through every ritual and routine of their training, that to surrender was not a military failure, but a personal and spiritual one. That death in the service of the emperor was not the worst outcome. That dying badly, that is to say, surrendering, was. This belief would define every battle they ever fought. It would make them extraordinary in defense. It would make them almost impossible to dislodge from positions a rational calculus said they should have abandoned. It would also mean that on island after island across the Pacific, garrisons that might have survived through surrender instead fought until the last man and the last bullet, and sometimes beyond both. The story of the Imperial Japanese Naval Landing Forces is the story of a weapon that was built for a particular kind of war, used brilliantly in that war's opening phases, and then ground down by the weight of a conflict that outgrew every plan and every doctrine that had been prepared for it. It is the story of individual men caught inside an institutional machine that gave them extraordinary purpose and asked of them an extraordinary price. Across 18 chapters, we will follow them from their origins in the debates and drill grounds of the early 20th century to their end, on the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima, in the cave systems of Okinawa, and on dozens of smaller islands where the names of the men who died are still, in many cases, unknown. The Pacific is a quiet place now. The atolls still sit where they have always sat, low and pale in the blue water, and the coral grows slowly over the steel and concrete that was left behind. If you know where to look, you can still find the bunkers. You can still find the guns. The tide has been coming in for a very long time. Let us go back to the beginning. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an island at low tide. The reef sits exposed. the water pulls back from the coral shelf, and for a few minutes, the whole weight of the ocean seems to pause and reconsider. In the long history of the Pacific, that pause before the water returns is a moment of profound vulnerability and profound possibility. Japan understood this better than almost any other nation. An archipelago by nature, a rising empire by ambition, Japan was a civilization shaped around the sea, and the men who would eventually carry its flag onto foreign shores were, in a very real sense, the product of everything the sea had taught their country. But the story of Japan's naval infantry does not begin with landings on coral beaches or the thunder of naval guns over jungle canopies. It begins much earlier, in a period of breathtaking national transformation, when a feudal kingdom shook itself awake and decided, with extraordinary deliberation, to become something the world had never quite seen before. The Meiji Restoration of the 1860s and 1870s was not a gradual evolution. It was a controlled detonation of the old order, a decision by Japan's ruling class to modernize or be consumed. The Western powers, Britain, France, the United States, the Netherlands, had spent decades demonstrating what naval and military force could accomplish against nations that had not kept pace with industrial warfare. Japan's leaders had watched, taken careful notes, and concluded that survival required transformation. Across every domain of statecraft, industry, law, medicine, education, and above all the military, Japan sent students abroad, hired foreign advisors, and systematically dismantled centuries of tradition in favor of whatever worked. It was one of the most concentrated exercises in institutional reinvention in recorded history, and the military was at the center of all of it. The Imperial Japanese Army modeled itself significantly on Prussian doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy looked primarily to Britain. The Royal Navy was, at the time, the supreme naval force on Earth, and the Japanese sent officers to study its methods with the kind of focused intensity that suggested they understood they were learning from a teacher they intended one day to surpass. British naval advisors arrived in Japan. Japanese naval cadets learned seamanship, gunnery, and the mechanics of the modern warship. What they also observed, carefully, even if it took time to fully register, was the relationship between a powerful navy and the troops it could project ashore. The British Royal Marines had existed in various forms for nearly 2 centuries, serving as shipboard security, boarding parties, and landing forces capable of seizing coastal positions to support naval operations. The United States Marine Corps offered a parallel model, an expeditionary force that could operate from ships, take beaches, and hold ground until heavier forces arrived. Japan had no equivalent. For the early Meiji Navy, that gap between sea power and shore power was something to be considered, debated, and eventually filled. The debate, however, was neither quick nor clean. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, there was no natural consensus about whether the service needed its own dedicated land-fighting force. The army, which controlled Japan's ground combat power, was deeply protective of its institutional territory. From the army's perspective, amphibious operations were simply a delivery mechanism. The Navy's job was to get soldiers to the shore, and what happened after the landing was army business. This view was not entirely unreasonable. It reflected how Western powers often divided those responsibilities. But the Navy had its own logic, and it was rooted in something pragmatic: shore-based operations in support of naval campaigns, seizing ports, holding anchorages, garrisoning islands the fleet needed to use, required troops who understood naval requirements, who could communicate with ships, who were accustomed to operating from vessels and thinking in terms of maritime objectives. Army units, whatever their fighting quality, were not trained for this. The friction between the two services over who owned the shoreline would persist for decades, and it would never be fully resolved. What emerged from those early institutional tensions was not a grand Marine Corps in the Western mold, but something more provisional. The Navy began training small contingents of sailors in basic infantry skills, men who could be landed from warships to protect Japanese interests ashore, to provide security at naval stations, or to reinforce diplomatic positions during moments of international pressure. These early formations had no permanent structure, no dedicated doctrine, and no established traditions of their own. They were ad hoc responses to immediate needs, and for much of the late 19th century, they remained that way. Japan's strategic focus during this period was primarily continental: the Korea question, the growing competition with China, and then the staggering test of the war against Russia in the first decade of the 20th century. These were primarily land and naval battles in the conventional sense, and they gave the Army, not the Navy, its defining institutional experiences. Yet the Navy watched those campaigns too, and drew its own conclusions. The war against Russia in 1904 and 1905 included operations that required landing troops under fire, seizing coastal fortifications, and coordinating the movement of ground forces with naval support. These were not easy operations. They exposed the difficulty of projecting power from sea to shore against a determined enemy, and they raised questions that the existing division of labor between the Army and Navy could not cleanly answer. An army transported by ships is not the same as a force designed from the beginning to fight its way onto a beach. The distinction would take years to fully crystallize in Japanese military thinking, but the seed was there, growing slowly in the background of the Navy's institutional memory. The Russo-Japanese War also produced something the Meiji government was careful to manage internationally: Japan's emergence as a recognized great power. The defeat of Russia's Baltic fleet at Tsushima in 1905 announced to the world that Japan had mastered modern naval warfare at the highest level. It was a moment that redefined what Japan believed itself capable of, and it accelerated the imperial ambitions that would eventually require a much more robust capacity for power projection. As Japan's sphere of influence extended into Korea, Manchuria, and across the Pacific, the question of how to secure and hold the outposts of empire became increasingly urgent. Islands needed garrisons, ports needed protection, concessions needed to be seized and held. The Navy needed men who could do these things. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Navy had begun to formalize what had previously been improvised. The concept of dedicated naval landing forces, units with their own identity, their own training, and their own organic equipment, began to take clearer shape. These were not yet the formations that would storm Pacific beaches 2 decades later, but they represented a genuine institutional commitment to the idea that the Navy needed its own soldiers. The study of Western Marine Corps models intensified. Officers who had observed American and British amphibious operations, both theoretical and historical, brought their notes back to Tokyo. The United States Marine Corps offered particular interest, having developed hard lessons in small unit amphibious operations through decades of intervention across the Caribbean and Central America. The British, meanwhile, had centuries of experience projecting naval power ashore in support of colonial ambitions. Japan absorbed what it could from both. What Japan could not simply absorb was the culture. The Western Marine Corps had evolved within specific national and historical contexts, and their identities, their ethos, their mythology, their relationship to the services and nations they served, could not be copied from a manual. Japan would have to build that culture itself. And in doing so, it would inevitably draw on something far older than any foreign model: the martial traditions of the samurai, the Confucian emphasis on duty and hierarchy, the Buddhist acceptance of death as a natural companion to the warrior's life. The men who would one day fill the ranks of the Special Naval Landing Forces would not see themselves as copies of American Marines or British commandos. They would see themselves as something distinctly Japanese, sailor soldiers shaped by the sea and by a tradition of service that demanded total devotion and permitted no compromise. That self-conception was still being formed in these early years, as carefully and deliberately as the ships that would carry these men to war. The first concrete formations emerged slowly, each one a refinement of the last, each one reflecting the ongoing argument within the Navy about exactly what these troops should be and what they should do. Some voices argued for a large, standing corps with permanent units, dedicated training facilities, and a clear place in the order of battle. Others pushed back, preferring smaller, more flexible detachments that could be assembled and dissolved as situations required, without the administrative overhead of a permanent force structure. This tension between institutional permanence and operational flexibility shaped the early development of Japanese naval infantry in ways that would have long consequences. The force that eventually went to war was neither the Grand Marine Corps some had envisioned, nor the simple collection of armed sailors others had been content with. It was something in between, capable, committed, and still working out what it was. Through the 1910s and into the 1920s, Japan's place in the world continued to shift. The First World War had rewarded Japan with German colonial possessions in the Pacific, islands scattered across enormous distances of open ocean, some of them barely specks of coral and palm, but strategically significant as way stations and potential bases. The League of Nations gave Japan a mandate over these territories, and the Navy looked at that archipelago of small islands and understood, with growing clarity, that holding them and using them, and, if necessary, fighting over them, would require exactly the kind of force it had been slowly assembling. The world was about to remind Japan, and Japan was about to remind the world, that where the sea meets the shore is where empires are made or broken. In barracks that smelled of salt and fresh concrete, in training grounds, where men ran until their legs gave out and then kept running, a new kind of Japanese warrior was being constructed. He did not yet have a name the world would fear. That would come later, on beaches and in jungles that most people in Tokyo had never heard of, in battles that would define the century and empty the islands that once held them. But he was coming. The tide was still coming in. Shanghai, in 1931, was one of the most crowded, contested, and combustible cities on Earth. It sat at the mouth of the Yangtze River, like a pressure valve on the edge of bursting, a place where Chinese sovereignty and foreign ambition had been grinding against each other for nearly a century. The international settlement carved the city into zones of competing influence, and Japanese commercial and military interests had been pressing deeper into that space for years. Warships from half a dozen nations sat anchored in the Huangpu River, their flags a reminder that Shanghai did not fully belong to anyone, and that everyone intended to keep it that way. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the city had become both a strategic prize and an ongoing provocation. Tensions between Japanese residents and Chinese civilians had been simmering for months, sharpened by nationalist sentiment on both sides, and by the broader regional upheaval following Japan's seizure of Manchuria, when violence between Japanese monks and Chinese workers escalated into a broader street confrontation in late January of 1932, the Navy moved. The units they sent into the streets were the Special Naval Landing Forces, and for most of those men, it was the first time they had ever been asked to fight. The first Shanghai incident, which erupted in earnest that January, was not the kind of operation anyone had designed the Special Naval Landing Forces for. The earliest SNLF formations had been assembled with a particular vision in mind: rapid descent from the sea, swift seizure of a port or beachhead, then consolidation and hold. What Shanghai offered instead was close-quarters street fighting through a maze of narrow alleys, densely packed residential blocks, factory districts, and walled compounds. The Chinese 19th Route Army, which held the Xiaobei district of the city, was neither demoralized nor poorly led. They were dug into prepared urban positions, and they met the initial Japanese naval infantry thrusts with a resistance that was, by almost any account, far stiffer than the Japanese command had expected. The assumption, barely spoken but clearly held, that Chinese forces would yield quickly to a show of naval strength did not survive contact with the first morning of fighting. Small SNLF units found themselves pinned in the open, taking fire from buildings they could not easily storm, against an enemy that understood the terrain far better than they did. The weaknesses that surfaced in those early days were painful and precise. Japanese naval infantrymen had been drilled extensively in physical conditioning, bayonet work, and the kind of martial spirit their training culture celebrated above almost everything else. What they lacked was the tactical sophistication for sustained urban combat, the patience, the coordination between small units, the disciplined use of covering fire while another element moved. Communications between sections broke down in the urban clutter. Officers who had trained for leading charges across open beaches found themselves struggling to maintain cohesion inside a city that swallowed formations whole. Supporting weapons, light machine guns, grenade launchers, were often not positioned where they could be most effective, because the men using them had not been trained to think in 3 dimensions within a built environment. In several engagements in Xiaobei, SNLF units had to be withdrawn and reorganized before they could make any meaningful progress, an embarrassment that filtered back up the chain of command with uncomfortable clarity. What made the situation more complicated still was that the world was watching. Shanghai's Foreign Press Corps was large, experienced, and operating in a city where they could walk from the international settlement into the combat zone and back in the same afternoon. Reports of Japanese naval troops stalling against Chinese resistance circulated internationally before the Navy's own dispatches had fully processed what was happening on the ground. Inside Japan, the early reverses in Xiaobei were not something the Navy was inclined to advertise, but they could not be entirely hidden either. The pressure on senior commanders was acute. More troops were fed into the city in waves over the following weeks, eventually including army units whose arrival was itself a kind of institutional indignity for a navy that had expected to manage the situation independently. The inter-service friction this generated would echo forward for years, hardening the Navy's determination to prove that its own fighting arm was capable of handling its own wars without army assistance. By the time a ceasefire was brokered in May of 1932, the Special Naval Landing Forces had accomplished their broad operational objectives. Xiaobei was in Japanese hands. Chinese forces had been pushed back, and the political outcome was one the Japanese government could accept. But the price and the method had exposed things that could not be comfortably ignored. Senior SNLF officers began an intensive after-action review process that was, for its time and within its institutional culture, unusually frank. The conclusions were not comfortable reading. Training for amphibious assault on open beaches was one skill. Fighting through a defended city was another. The force had been sent to do the second thing, using preparation primarily designed for the first. That gap between doctrine and reality would drive the changes that followed in the years between the 2 Shanghai incidents. Those changes accumulated quietly through the middle years of the decade, in training facilities and on exercise grounds far from international scrutiny. Emphasis on small unit tactical coordination increased. Officers were instructed to study urban warfare more specifically, not merely as a variant of open assault, but as a distinct environment requiring its own approaches. The Senov began developing closer relationships with supporting arms, naval gunfire, aircraft, artillery, and working through how those relationships should function in practice, rather than simply in theory. Physical training, already brutal, was pushed further, partly because hardship was genuinely useful preparation, and partly because the culture of the Rikusentai had come to treat suffering as a kind of proof of worth. New equipment moved through the procurement system, though slowly, and not always in quantities that matched the scale of ambition. The force that prepared for Shanghai the second time was meaningfully different from the one that had stumbled through Xiaobei in 1932. The second Shanghai incident arrived in August of 1937, born from a broader collapse of relations between Japan and China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident the previous month. By this point, the conflict was no longer a localized confrontation over a specific grievance. It was the opening of what the Chinese would call the War of Resistance, and what Japanese planners treated as a punitive campaign they expected to conclude quickly. The SNLF was again at the center of the naval response in Shanghai, tasked with protecting Japanese interests in the city and supporting operations to drive Chinese forces back from the urban perimeter. What they encountered, once again, was a Chinese military that had not read the script they had been handed. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek had deliberately chosen Shanghai as a place to make a stand, calculating that fighting there would draw international attention and potentially international support. The scale of the second engagement dwarfed anything the naval infantry had faced before. Chinese nationalist forces, including some of their best equipped and most committed divisions, threw themselves at Japanese positions with a ferocity that even veteran self officers found arresting. The fighting along the Suzhou Creek and through the industrial districts of the city was not a rapid operation concluded in days. It ground on for weeks and then months, consuming men and materiel at a rate that the initial operational plans had not accounted for. SNLF units holding bridgeheads and building-to-building positions faced near constant pressure, artillery fire, and in some sectors, conditions that resembled the static attritional warfare of a previous generation's European memories. The naval infantry fought hard, and in many sectors fought well, but the ease the operation was supposed to demonstrate for an international audience never materialized. Yet from within that grinding experience, something valuable was being forged. The men who survived the second battle for Shanghai came out of it, carrying a kind of knowledge that cannot be written into a training manual. They understood how fear behaves over days and weeks rather than hours. They had learned how to maintain unit cohesion when sleep was a luxury, and the next assault might come at any moment. They had seen what happened when fire support arrived late, when communication failed, when momentum stalled, and they had learned, at great cost, what it took to restore it. These veterans became the living institutional memory of the Special Naval Landing Forces, circulating back through training establishments as instructors, or forward into planning roles, or laterally into the expanding network of SNLF formations being assembled across the Navy, as Japan's strategic ambitions continued to grow. The China campaigns also produced something less constructive, a set of assumptions about Japanese military superiority, that the difficulty of the actual fighting should, perhaps, have complicated more thoroughly than it did. Victories had been won, objectives had been seized, and the narrative of inevitable Japanese triumph was powerful enough to absorb the awkward details that didn't quite fit. The tenacity of Chinese resistance, the casualties absorbed in the process of victory, the operational timelines that had stretched far beyond initial estimates, these became footnotes rather than headlines. A force that might have emerged from Shanghai, asking harder questions about the limits of its own doctrine, instead emerged with its confidence broadly intact, shaped by the genuine toughness of its experience, but not yet forced to reckon with whether that toughness alone would be sufficient for what was coming. What Shanghai gave the Special Naval Landing Forces was irreplaceable. It gave them their first real test, their first dead, and their first honest encounter with the difference between what they had been trained to do and what war actually demanded. It produced a generation of hardened, capable junior and mid-level officers who understood combat not as an abstraction, but as a physical and psychological reality they had lived through and survived. It exposed the gaps between doctrine and practice with enough precision to drive meaningful reform in the years that followed. And it planted in the institutional character of the Sanlef an absolute refusal to concede, a quality that would inspire awe and horror in equal measure across the island battles of the Pacific, and that would, ultimately, consume the force that carried it. The beaches and atolls were still years away, but the spirit that would hold them and die on them was already being formed in the smoke and rubble of a Chinese city, in the hard early days of a long and terrible war. They did not call themselves Marines. That word belonged to another navy, another empire, another tradition carried across the Atlantic, in the hulls of British warships, and borrowed eventually by the Americans, who refined it into something formidable. The men of Japan's Special Naval Landing Forces had their own name, earned through their own rituals, their own suffering, their own particular understanding of what it meant to fight for the emperor on the shore. They called themselves, informally, the Rikusentai, Naval Land Combat Personnel, and the distinction mattered enormously to them. Not soldiers, not sailors, something in between, and in their own estimation, something superior to both. To understand the Rikusentai is to understand first the institution that produced them, the Imperial Japanese Navy, which regarded the Imperial Japanese Army with a suspicion that occasionally hardened into outright contempt. The two services competed for budget allocations, for strategic priority, for the emperor's attention, and for the narrative of what Japan's future should look like. The army saw the continent, China, Manchuria, eventually Soviet Russia, as the arena where Japan's destiny would be decided. The Navy looked outward, across the blue distances of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, to islands and sea lanes, and the projection of maritime power. These were not merely strategic disagreements. They were civilizational arguments, dressed in military uniform, and they poisoned joint planning at almost every level throughout the war years. The Rikusentai existed, partly because the Navy refused to depend on army troops for the seizure of coastal and island objectives. To request army assistance was to admit a kind of inadequacy, to hand strategic leverage to a rival service. Better to build your own infantry, train them your own way, and keep control entirely within naval hands. The formal structure of the Special Naval Landing Forces was built around the unit known as a Special Naval Landing Force Detachment, a formation roughly analogous to a Western infantry battalion in size, though the precise composition varied considerably depending on the operation and the period of the war. Each force carried a geographic designation tied to the naval base district from which it was organized: Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, Maizuru. The great naval stations of the home islands each contributed their own formations, and those designations became markers of institutional pride. A man from a Kure unit and a man from a Yokosuka unit might regard each other with the same quiet competitiveness that characterized naval rivalries everywhere, but put either of them alongside an army infantryman, and the competitiveness collapsed immediately into a unified front of naval superiority. The army were ground grubbers, in the Navy's view. The Rikusentai were something finer. What made them finer, at least in their own understanding, began with selection and never really ended. The men who entered naval landing force training were drawn from naval enlisted ranks, volunteers, and assigned personnel who had already passed through the basic physical and ideological conditioning of Imperial Japanese naval service. What awaited them in specialized training was considerably more demanding. Physical conditioning was relentless and deliberately punishing. Long-distance runs, carrying full equipment across terrain, specifically chosen for its difficulty. Swimming drills in open water, regardless of weather or season. Obstacle courses, designed not merely to build fitness, but to expose and eliminate weakness. Instructors understood that an amphibious assault, the moment of climbing from a landing craft into surf and fire, demanded a quality of physical endurance that went beyond ordinary military fitness. A man who quit under manageable suffering would certainly quit under the unmanageable kind. Bayonet training occupied a place in Rikusentai culture that went well beyond its tactical utility. The bayonet was a philosophical statement as much as a weapon. It represented the acceptance of close quarters, the willingness to close with an enemy at personal risk, the absolute rejection of the idea that distance and technology were preferable to direct, visceral combat. Training sessions were extended, painful, and conducted with a ferocity that left men bruised and occasionally injured even before they had faced an actual enemy. The instructors who drove this training were not sadists in the casual sense. They were true believers who understood that the capacity to attack without flinching, to cross the last few meters of open ground when every instinct screamed retreat, was not a natural human quality. It had to be manufactured through repetition and controlled violence until it became something close to reflex. Alongside bayonet work came instruction in hand grenade use, in the rapid assault of fixed positions, in the kind of close-quarters fighting that turns a pillbox or a trench line into a personal confrontation rather than a tactical problem. The uniforms and visual identity of the Rikusentai reflected their hybrid nature with a care that spoke of deliberate institution building. Their basic dress retained the naval coloring and structural elements that distinguished them from army khaki, even as it incorporated practical modifications suited to land combat. Anchor insignia appeared on collars and caps, a constant reminder that these were naval men fighting on land, not soldiers who happened to be near the sea. In tropical climates, the uniform adapted to lighter materials and practical field modifications, but the naval identity was preserved. Officers wore their rank with the particular pride of men who had earned dual status, sea-trained and combat-qualified for shore assault. This visual distinctiveness was not vanity. In an institution as identity-conscious as the Imperial Japanese Navy, appearance and insignia were part of the continuous work of unit cohesion, of making men feel they belonged to something worth dying for. The psychological dimension of Rikusentai training was perhaps its most consequential element, and it operated through a framework that the broader Japanese military had absorbed from Bushido, the warrior tradition, but had reinterpreted specifically for the modern armed forces. Surrender was not presented as merely dishonorable. It was presented as literally unthinkable, a category error so profound that a man who genuinely embodied the Rikusentai identity would find it psychologically impossible to perform. This was not achieved through a single lecture or a written code handed to new recruits. It was achieved through the accumulated weight of every training session, every shared hardship, every ritual affirmation of the unit's identity, every story told about what had happened to men who fought to the last and what such fighting meant. By the time a Rikusentai soldier reached his first combat assignment, the refusal to surrender was not a decision he would need to make. It was something closer to a fixed point of his identity, as fundamental as his name. The relationship between officers and enlisted men in the Rikusentai carried the particular texture of naval discipline, overlaid with a warrior ethos that demanded visible personal courage from those who led. An officer who directed his men from safety lost something irreplaceable in the tight world of a naval landing force. Not simply their respect, but their belief in the unit's essential character. Leadership in the Rikusentai was expected to be conspicuous, even reckless, by the standards of professional military thinking elsewhere. Officers led assaults from the front, held positions alongside their men in the final moments of a hopeless defense, and were expected to die before they ordered a retreat they could not justify. This was not cynicism dressed as leadership theory. It was the genuine operational expression of an ideology that permeated every level of the force. Inter-service rivalry shaped the Rikusentai's institutional character in ways that went beyond mere bureaucratic competition. Because the Navy controlled its own land forces independently, the Rikusentai received equipment, training priorities, and operational assignments through a chain of command that had no formal army input whatsoever. This produced genuine tactical innovations. The Navy's interest in amphibious doctrine meant the Rikusentai often trained more rigorously for the specific challenges of water-to-shore assault than most army units ever did. But it also produced dangerous gaps. The two services shared intelligence poorly, coordinated logistics grudgingly, and on multiple occasions during the war's middle and later years, Army and Navy garrison forces on the same island operated with insufficient communication, duplicating effort in some areas and leaving fatal gaps in others. The Rikusentai institutional pride in its independence was real and understandable. The cost of that independence, when the enemy came ashore, was sometimes paid in blood. What the training and the culture and the rivalry all served, ultimately, was a particular vision of the Rikusentai soldier as a complete warrior, equally at home on a landing craft moving through pre-dawn darkness toward a defended shore and in a fortified position waiting for an enemy to come to him. This versatility was the theoretical ideal, and in the early years of the war, the quality of the men and the soundness of the training came close enough to realizing it that the Rikusentai earned genuine fear and genuine respect from those who faced them. They were not invincible. The battles already described in China had made certain vulnerabilities unmistakably clear, but they were formidable, and they knew it. And knowing it was itself a form of combat power that should not be underestimated. The name Rikusentai would never achieve the global recognition of terms like Marine or Commando. It belonged to a force that fought on islands most people could not have located on a map, in a war that ended badly for everything it was built to serve. But inside the institution, in the years when the empire was expanding and the landings were going well, and the Navy's flag was rising over one captured shore after another, the name meant something profound. It meant you had been selected, conditioned, shaped, and tested, until the person you had been before the training was difficult to remember clearly. It meant you belonged to a brotherhood that measured itself against the hardest possible standard and refused, on principle, to be found wanting. What that brotherhood would be required to endure in the years ahead, on Tulagi, on Tarawa, on 100 coral atolls where the sea came in warm and the American guns came in louder, was something that even the most demanding training had not fully prepared them for. But they would face it as they had been made to face everything, without flinching and without surrender. While the men of the Special Naval Landing Forces were learning the brutal calculus of urban combat in the alleys of Shanghai, another kind of war was being waged in conference rooms, dockyards, and testing ranges back home. Officers with chalk dust on their uniforms and salt spray in their memories were wrestling with a question that no navy in the world had fully answered. How do you put fighting men onto a hostile shore faster than the enemy can kill them? The Japanese were not the only ones asking, but for a stretch of years running through the mid-1930s, they were perhaps the ones working hardest to find out. What emerged from that effort was not a single breakthrough, but a slow accumulation of steel, doctrine, and hard-won principle, a way of thinking about amphibious war that would shape every beach assault in the Pacific, on both sides of the waterline. The foundation of all of it was the landing craft. Without a reliable, purpose-built vessel capable of carrying armed men from ship to shore under fire, amphibious doctrine was nothing but theory written in margins. Japan's answer was the Daihatsu, a steel-hulled, flat-bottomed powered barge that became the workhorse of every major naval landing the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever conduct. Roughly 14 meters in length, capable of carrying a full platoon of troops, or a light vehicle, and fitted with a bow ramp that dropped directly onto the beach, the Daihatsu represented a serious engineering commitment to the problem of the last few hundred meters. It was not fast, and it was not elegant, but it was robust and practical in a way that earlier improvised designs had never been. The Navy refined it through successive iterations, adding armor protection in places, improving the ramp mechanism, and experimenting with different load configurations. When Western military observers looked at it in the late 1930s, some dismissed it. That dismissal would later cost them. Alongside the Daihatsu, Japanese engineers developed a smaller variant designed for reconnaissance and raiding, a lighter craft that could be launched quickly and quietly, carrying a handful of men onto a dark shore without the noise and silhouette of a larger vessel. The Special Naval Landing Forces trained extensively with both types, practicing embarkation and debarkation until the sequences became instinct rather than procedure. Night landings received particular emphasis. Japanese amphibious doctrine, from a relatively early stage, assumed that surprise was more valuable than firepower in the initial moment of landing, and that a force reaching the beach before the defender was fully alert could establish a foothold that heavier follow-on waves could then exploit. This was not a new idea in warfare, but the systematic, repeated practice of it, integrating the craft, the timing, the navigation, and the combat formation, was something the Japanese pursued with unusual thoroughness. The doctrine did not begin and end at the waterline. Once ashore, the naval infantry needed firepower that could move with them over terrain that often had no roads and no infrastructure. This requirement drove the development and adaptation of weapons that were specifically chosen for portability without sacrificing lethality. Light artillery pieces that could be broken down and carried by small teams were central to SENOLF equipment tables. Infantry mortars of various calibers gave platoon commanders indirect fire support without needing to wait for heavier guns to be landed. Heavy machine guns, the kind that could pin a defending force into its positions while assault teams worked around the flanks, were standard elements of the landing forces organization, and considerable thought went into how quickly they could be set up and made effective after coming ashore. The whole weapons mix reflected a philosophy that prized the ability to create shock and violence of action immediately on landing, before the defender could recover. Light tanks entered the amphibious picture in the 1930s as well, and their role in Senov doctrine is worth examining closely. The vehicles selected were never the heaviest or most powerful that Japanese industry produced. They could not be, given the constraints of landing craft capacity and the terrain of the islands Japan expected to fight over. But a light tank arriving on a beach, even minutes after the first infantry wave, carried a psychological and physical weight entirely disproportionate to its armor thickness. Against defenders equipped primarily with small arms and light weapons, which described most of the colonial garrisons Japan anticipated facing in its initial campaigns, a tank rolling off a Daihatsu ramp could break resistance almost immediately. Senelef planners understood this and made provision for armored support in their landing tables, at a time when many Western amphibious thinking still treated tanks as an afterthought, to be landed only after a secure beachhead had been established. Naval gunfire support was perhaps the most complex element of the doctrine to get right, and it was also the one where Japan's thinking showed the deepest sophistication. The problem was fundamentally one of timing and communication. A warship's guns could theoretically pulverize any beach defense before troops landed, but the moment the infantry started moving toward shore, those guns had to either fall silent or shift their fire, and in either case, the defender had a window to recover and man his weapons. Japanese doctrine tried to compress that window to almost nothing, keeping fire on the beach until the landing craft were almost at the surf line, and then lifting it to targets further inland in a coordinated sequence. Shore fire control parties, observers who went in with the first wave and communicated ship positions back to the vessels, were trained to maintain this coordination under conditions of noise, smoke, and chaos that made clear communication nearly impossible. It was imperfect, as all such systems are, but it was a genuine attempt to solve a genuinely hard problem. The integration of naval aviation into the amphibious equation was a further dimension that Japanese planners took seriously earlier than most. Carrier-based aircraft could suppress defensive positions, interdict reinforcements moving toward the landing beach, and provide the assault force with a kind of overhead vision that ground commanders operating in the smoke and confusion of a beach landing could never otherwise have. The relationship between the carrier force and the landing force was never entirely smooth. The Navy's airmen had their own priorities, and communications between ship, air, and shore remained a persistent technical challenge throughout the pre-war period. But the conceptual framework that saw carrier aviation as an integral part of amphibious operations, rather than a separate and independent arm, was embedded in Japanese naval thinking well before the first shots of the Pacific War were fired. Doctrine is only as good as the exercises that test it, and the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted large-scale amphibious training exercises through the 1930s with a regularity and seriousness that reflected genuine institutional commitment. Entire SNLF units rehearsed landings on simulated hostile beaches, with defending forces playing the role of the enemy and instructors watching for every failure of timing, communication, and fire coordination. After-action reviews were thorough and often harsh. Officers who had made errors in navigation or failed to maintain unit cohesion during the transition from craft to beach were told so directly. The culture of the exercises was not comfortable, but it was productive. It generated a body of institutional knowledge about what actually happened when you put men in boats and drove them at a defended shore, knowledge that could not be obtained any other way. Beyond the mechanics of assault, Japanese amphibious doctrine had a second phase that Western thinking often underestimated: the rapid fortification of captured positions. The seizure of an island was, in the Japanese framework, only the beginning of the operation. Once troops were ashore and resistance had been overcome, the immediate priority was to make the position defensible against counterattack. Engineering detachments and construction units followed the assault waves specifically for this purpose, bringing with them the tools and materials to begin converting a seized beach into a prepared defensive position within hours of the landing. Bunkers were sited, fields of fire were cleared, artillery was positioned on reverse slopes to protect it from naval fire, and communications networks were established. The idea was that an island taken quickly and then fortified quickly became an island. This dual emphasis on assault and fortification reflected a strategic logic that was central to Japan's entire Pacific design. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not expect to hold every island it seized by fighting a mobile battle at sea, at least not indefinitely. What it expected to do was create a perimeter of fortified positions so costly to assault that the United States and its allies would eventually conclude that the price of rolling them back was too high. Each island was to be a toll gate on the road to Japan, and the Sendleff was both the force that seized those toll gates and, in many cases, the garrison that manned them afterward. The same men trained to storm a beach were also trained to transform it into a fortress, and that dual identity was built into their organization and their thinking from the beginning. By the time the 1930s drew toward their close, Japan had assembled a body of amphibious doctrine and capability that was, in several respects, the most developed in the world. The Daihatsu and its derivatives gave the Navy a genuine ship-to-shore transport capability. The weapons mix was coherent and adapted to the specific demands of island warfare. The integration of naval gunfire and aviation support, while imperfect, rested on a serious theoretical framework. And the doctrine of seizure, followed by rapid fortification, gave the entire enterprise a strategic coherence that pure assault thinking lacked. None of this guaranteed success. Doctrine is always in conversation with the enemy, and the enemy always has a vote. But as the guns of December 1941 began to sound across the Pacific, Japan's naval infantry carried with them a set of tools and ideas that were about to be tested against real coastlines, real defenses, and real resistance in a campaign of opening conquests that would briefly make them appear nearly unstoppable. In the first hours of December 8th, 1941, the 8th, because the international dateline placed Japan's Western Pacific operations a calendar day ahead of Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy's southern strategy snapped into motion with the precision of a mechanism long wound and finally released. Across thousands of kilometers of ocean, separate assault forces were already at sea, coordinated with a logistical ambition that the world had not yet learned to associate with Japanese naval power. Pearl Harbor would dominate the headlines and the memory. But while the battleships were still burning in Hawaiian waters, Sendleff units were executing landings that would reshape the map of the Pacific within weeks. These were not improvised raids. They were the harvest of years of doctrine, training, and institutional desire. The moment the Rikusentai stepped from the training grounds of China onto the stage of a genuinely global war. The targets were modest in size and enormous in consequence. Guam and Wake Island, two specks of American-held territory embedded in Japan's intended defensive perimeter, like splinters that needed extraction before the wound could close. Guam was the softer target, and the Japanese planners knew it. The island held a small American garrison, naval personnel, Marines, and local Chamorro guardsmen, without air cover, without meaningful reinforcement, and without any realistic prospect of resistance that would significantly delay a determined assault. The Sendleff force assigned to Guam arrived in overwhelming strength relative to the defenders. and the operation that unfolded in the early morning hours of the 8th reflected that disproportion. Landing parties moved ashore at multiple points simultaneously, pressing inland against defenders who fought with genuine courage in circumstances that offered them almost no tactical advantage. The American and Chamorro defenders held their positions for hours before the weight of numbers and the collapse of coherent defensive lines made further resistance impossible. By the end of that first day, the island had passed from American to Japanese control, and the rising sun was raised over territory that had flown the stars and stripes since the end of the Spanish-American War. To the planners in Tokyo, it was clean, efficient, and entirely expected. To the world watching, it was one more piece of evidence that the machine set in motion at Pearl Harbor was not a single blow, but the opening movement of something far larger. What no one in Tokyo fully expected was what happened next at Wake Island. That story would unfold differently, and the difference would matter in ways the Japanese High Command was not yet equipped to appreciate. Wake was a coral atoll, roughly 3,000 kilometers west of Hawaii, garrisoned by a small Marine Defense Battalion, a contingent of naval personnel, and several hundred civilian construction workers who had been building facilities on the island when the war found them. The Marines had artillery, some coastal defense guns of genuine weight, and a handful of Grumman Wildcat fighters from a Marine fighter squadron. What they had most, though, was stubbornness, the particular, unmovable stubbornness of men who understood they were alone and chose to fight anyway. The first Japanese attempt to land on Wake came on the 11th of December 1941, 3 days after the initial airstrikes that had torn up the airstrip and destroyed aircraft on the ground. A naval bombardment force approached the island with Sentinel F troops embarked, confident that the defenders had been sufficiently suppressed to make the landing straightforward. The Marine gunners on shore let the ships close the range before opening fire. What followed was one of the most startling reversals of the opening Pacific War. The shore batteries struck multiple Japanese vessels, including a destroyer that was sunk with all hands. The Marine fighters, impossibly, were still flying, and they pressed attacks against the Japanese ships with a ferocity that turned confidence into something approaching alarm. The landing force withdrew. A Japanese amphibious assault had been beaten back by a garrison that was supposed to be finished. The news ricocheted across the Pacific and beyond. Wake had held. For a moment, brief, burning, and ultimately illusory, Wake Island became a symbol of something the Allied world desperately needed. The image of a small garrison refusing to break, of naval guns turned against a superior force, of fighters rising from a bombed runway to sting an enemy who thought himself invulnerable, fed a narrative that the shock of Pearl Harbor had made almost impossible to sustain. Messages of encouragement came from the highest levels of American command. Relief was discussed, planned, and ultimately not sent, a decision freighted with its own tragedy that belongs to another story. What matters here is what the first repulse revealed, that Sentinel F planning had underestimated the capacity of a resolute defense, supported by even a small amount of air power and well-sighted artillery. The assumption that suppression equaled neutralization had been tested and found wrong. The Japanese did not make the same mistake twice. A significantly larger force was assembled for the second attempt. Additional warships, more Sentinel F troops, and crucially, fleet carriers detached from the Pearl Harbor striking force, whose aircraft could properly suppress the island before the infantry went ashore. The second assault came in the early hours of the 23rd of December. It was nothing like the first. The scale of air support was overwhelming, the naval bombardment prolonged and far heavier than anything the garrison's guns could survive in their exposed positions, and the Sentinel landing parties came ashore at multiple points in darkness, fighting through the island's defenses in brutal close-quarters combat through the night. The Marine commander made the decision to surrender in the morning hours, when further resistance would have meant the deaths of the wounded and the civilian workers without any corresponding military purpose. Wake Island fell. The two-stage battle at Wake distilled something important about the Sendal F at this precise moment in history. The force that rebounded from the first repulse, reassembled with greater resources, and executed a successful night assault across a defended coral reef was demonstrably capable, adaptive, and aggressive. The commanders who had not properly assessed the defenders' remaining combat power before that first landing were, equally demonstrably, operating with assumptions that felt more like expectations. A belief that the opening airstrikes would have done enough, that the moral shock of Pearl Harbor would have translated into paralysis, that a small American garrison on a remote atoll had no real fight left in it. The correction cost Japan a destroyer and several days of strategic momentum. It was a correctable error, and they corrected it. But the pattern, assumption, check, correction, carried within it the seed of something more dangerous, something that would not always find correction in time. Across both Guam and Wake, the Sinulf had demonstrated its operational reach. Naval infantry trained in Japan had conducted coordinated amphibious assaults across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, seized defended positions, and begun the garrisoning of islands that would anchor Japan's new defensive perimeter. The logistics chain required to sustain multiple simultaneous operations across such distances was genuinely impressive. The inter-service coordination between the Navy's surface and air elements and the landing forces, while never perfectly smooth, had functioned well enough to accomplish the mission in both cases. Japan's high command looked at the map and saw a string of new possessions stretching from the Central Pacific towards Southeast Asia, and the temptation to interpret that map as evidence of an invincible system was powerful and understandable, and almost entirely wrong. What the map could not show was the texture of the resistance. The defenders of Guam had fought harder than anticipated before being overwhelmed. The defenders of Wake had beaten back one assault and required a major reallocation of fleet assets to subdue. These were not nothing. These were signals, faint and easily drowned in the noise of early success, that the enemy Japan had entered into conflict with was not going to exhaust itself gracefully. The American Marine Corps in particular, the institutional counterpart the CENLF most directly mirrored, had in those weeks on Wake shown a quality that transcended the specific tactical circumstances, a refusal to accept the premise that resistance was futile. The Rikusentai had the same quality. The collision of those two refusals across the reefs and atolls of the Pacific was still forming on the horizon, still assembling itself from the scattered pieces of doctrine and hardware and human will that neither side had yet fully tested. Through December and into January, CENLF units in the broader theater continued operating at a pace that left little time for the kind of reflection those early engagements deserved. The Southern strategy was not a plan with a pause built into it. The momentum of the opening weeks carried its own gravitational pull, and units were tasked, embarked, and committed faster than any systematic lessons-learned process could absorb. Officers who had been at Wake understood what had gone wrong on the 11th of December, whether that understanding propagated outward through the force, whether it changed how other CENLF commanders assessed their targets, their fire support requirements, their margins for error, is a harder question. Institutions under the pressure of continuous operations tend to process success more readily than they process the warning notes embedded in that success. What the opening Pacific campaigns bequeathed to the CENLF was a dangerous form of credibility. The force had performed. It had seized its objectives. It had crossed oceans and taken islands from a power that would eventually prove to be the most industrially capable nation in the history of warfare. For a few weeks in December 1941, the Rikusentai stood at what felt like the summit of everything the Meiji reformers had imagined when they first looked at Western Marine forces and decided Japan needed something of its own. The view from that summit was intoxicating. The distance to the ground was not yet visible. Somewhere out in the Pacific, on islands whose names most Japanese planners had not yet had reason to look up, the reckoning was being quietly assembled. One reef, one atoll, one American decision to fight back at a time. While the smoke still hung over Pearl Harbor and the echoes of Wake Island faded into the deep Pacific, Japan's war machine had already pivoted south. The opening weeks of 1942 belonged to speed. Imperial planners had spent years studying the resource map of Southeast Asia, and what they saw was a lifeline waiting to be cut free from its European owners. The Dutch East Indies, a vast scatter of islands stretching across 3,000 miles of equatorial sea, held something Japan needed more desperately than any battle flag or strategic port: oil. Without it, every warship sat idle, every aircraft stayed grounded, every tank rusted in place. The special naval landing forces would not be asked to hold the line in these operations. They would be asked to move faster than the enemy could think. The Netherlands had fallen to Germany in the spring of 1940, leaving its colonial government in the East Indies to defend an empire with forces that were brave but thin, under-equipped, and operating without any realistic hope of reinforcement. The Dutch colonial military knew what was coming. They had watched the fall of Malaya, the siege of Hong Kong, and the disintegration of Allied resistance across the region with mounting dread. Their plan was not to win, it was to delay, to deny, and, where possible, to destroy the very infrastructure Japan was racing to capture intact. The oil refineries at Tarakan, on the northeastern coast of Borneo, became the first test of that denial strategy, and the first test of whether the Snollef could move quickly enough to stop it. Tarakan was, by most measures, a small island, but it sat atop oil reserves of enormous consequence, and the refinery infrastructure built there over decades of Dutch colonial investment made it a prize worth considerable risk. Japanese naval infantry came ashore in the darkness of mid-January 1942, threading through coastal waters against light but determined resistance. The Dutch defenders fought where they could, but the landing force was well coordinated. The naval gunfire support was precise, and the Selef units moved with the kind of practiced aggression they had refined through years of training and 2 rounds of urban combat in Shanghai. The Dutch garrison fought and then fell back. What they left behind, however, was a refinery partly demolished by their own engineers, a calculated act of economic warfare that Japanese commanders had feared, and that demonstrated, plainly, that this campaign would not be a clean acquisition of resources. It would be a race against deliberate destruction. Within days of the Tarakan landing, Senolf and associated naval landing units were already preparing to strike further south, toward Balikpapan. If Tarakan was the opening move, Balikpapan was the real prize, one of the largest and most productive oil refining centers in the entire Dutch colonial empire, sitting on the southeastern coast of Borneo. The refinery there processed crude in quantities that could meaningfully shift Japan's fuel calculations for the broader war. The Japanese landing force descended on Balikpapan in the final days of January, and here, the Dutch defenders again proved they understood the strategic calculus. Before the Senolf could secure the facility, Dutch engineers put the torch to what they could. Flames visible from miles at sea rose over the refinery, and the acrid smell of burning petroleum drifted out across the water as the naval infantry came ashore. The Japanese had the land. They would have to rebuild what they needed from the ruins. The Balikpapan operation produced one of the most striking naval engagements of the entire East Indies campaign, one the Sulef would not easily forget. A small force of American destroyers, operating on limited intelligence and extraordinary audacity, slipped into the anchorage during the landing and tore through the transport fleet in a night attack that sank several vessels and killed personnel the Japanese could ill afford to lose so early in the campaign. For the naval infantry waiting on transports or already ashore, it was a brutal reminder that even overwhelming strategic momentum could not insulate individual operations from catastrophic surprise. The losses were absorbed, the campaign continued, but the attack at Balikpapan introduced a note of uncertainty into what Japanese planners had expected to be an almost frictionless advance. They pushed on. The operational tempo of those first 2 months of 1942 was staggering in its breadth. Celebes, the vast, arm-shaped island to the east of Borneo, fell under assault from multiple directions, nearly simultaneously. Senelef units landed at Manado in the north and at Kendari in the southeast, the latter's airfield being of particular strategic value, as it extended Japanese air coverage further into the approaches of the Flores Sea and beyond. The Dutch and small Allied contingents defending these positions were simply outpaced. Before reinforcements could be conceptualized, let alone organized and transported, the Japanese had already landed, consolidated, and begun pushing inland. The Rikusentai in these weeks moved with a confidence that bordered on contempt, not for the courage of the men opposing them, but for the structural impossibility of the Allied defensive situation. The Moluccas fell into the same whirlwind. Ambon, a small island with a Dutch and Australian garrison, holding an airfield of real operational significance, became the site of one of the more intense defensive struggles in the East Indies campaign. Australian soldiers fought alongside Dutch colonial troops for days against a Japanese assault that combined naval infantry with conventional army units in a coordinated hammer blow. The garrison was overwhelmed. Those who survived faced years of brutal captivity. The Snelf's role in the Ambon operation reinforced a pattern that was becoming clear across the entire East Indies campaign. The Japanese could take what they wanted. The question of what they would do with it once taken was beginning to reveal itself as considerably more complicated. The pace of conquest masked serious structural problems that were accumulating beneath the surface of every triumphant landing. Each island seized required a garrison. Each garrison required supply. Each supply line stretched further back toward Japan, across waters that were already showing signs of strain, threading through a logistics network that had been designed for a far more limited strategic footprint. The Senelef units that had swept through the East Indies in a matter of weeks were now being parceled out across dozens of positions, their strength diluted across an enormous geographic area. The very speed that had made the campaign look effortless was consuming the reserves of trained naval infantry faster than any pre-war planner had honestly accounted for. The men who had practiced these landings on training beaches in Japan had not been trained for the long, grinding business of garrison duty in equatorial heat, cut off from reliable resupply. The oil, when it finally began flowing again after months of Japanese repair work on the sabotaged facilities, did provide Japan with a meaningful portion of the fuel its war machine required. This was not a trivial achievement. The strategic rationale for the entire southern campaign rested on this acquisition, and by that measure, the Senelef and the broader naval and army forces that swept through the East Indies had delivered what their commanders demanded. But the cost was already being paid in ways that balance sheets of barrels and conquest could not easily capture. Experienced naval infantry NCOs and junior officers, men who had survived Shanghai and then led their units through half a dozen separate landings in the space of weeks, were being asked to manage outposts on islands whose names barely appeared on maps. Their expertise was being buried in garrison duty rather than concentrated for the next decisive blow. There was a psychological dimension to this period that deserves attention. The men of the Selef had been molded from the beginning of their training to understand themselves as assault troops, warriors whose purpose was to strike, to overwhelm, to plant the naval ensign on contested shores, and move on. The culture of the Reichssentai was built around aggression, around the moral and physical primacy of offensive action, static defense, watching the horizon, waiting for an enemy who might or might not come. This was not what they had signed for, and it was not what the force's institutional character was designed to sustain. In the early months of 1942, with each new operation announced, and each new flag raised over another conquered island, that tension could still be suppressed by the momentum of victory. It would not stay suppressed forever. The Dutch colonial empire, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a functioning military entity within roughly 3 months of Japan's initial onslaught. A colonial structure that had administered these islands for more than 3 centuries was dismantled in a campaign measured in weeks, seized by a naval infantry force that was, in many respects, making up in speed and aggression what it lacked in long-term strategic staying power. The men who had planned the East Indies campaign in Tokyo had achieved almost everything they set out to achieve. The oil was theirs, the airfields were theirs, the sea lanes were, for the moment, theirs to command. What was not visible in the victory dispatches radioing back to naval headquarters was the shape of what was coming. The vast Allied industrial machine beginning to turn, the shipyards filling with vessels, the training camps filling with men, the strategic weight that would eventually roll back across every mile of ocean the Selef had crossed in those intoxicating early weeks. For now, though, the Imperial Japanese naval landing forces stood at the absolute height of their reach. From the oil-stained shores of Borneo to the airfields of Celebes to the battered garrison posts of the Moluccas, they had demonstrated an amphibious capability that stunned the world and reshaped the map of Southeast Asia in a time frame no Western military planner had believed possible. The next challenge was already forming on the horizon, further east, in the Solomon Islands and across the Central Pacific, where the geometry of empire would begin, slowly and then with gathering force, to work against them. The tide that had swept south with such terrifying speed would, in time, have to find a shore it could not cross. By the spring of 1942, Japan stood at the apex of its territorial reach. The victories had come so quickly, so completely, that the maps in Tokyo's war rooms could scarcely keep pace with the reality on the ground. In just 5 months, the empire had seized an area larger than the continental United States. The Special Naval Landing Forces had been the spearhead of this expansion, their amphibious columns island-hopping across the southwestern Pacific and into Southeast Asia, with a precision that seemed to defy geography itself. But now, in the middle months of the year, the question that faced Japan's military planners was no longer how to expand, it was how to hold. The answer they sought was nothing less than the creation of a defensive perimeter so vast, so layered with garrison troops and fortified positions, that no enemy could possibly breach it. It was an ambition born of both vision and desperation, and it would pull the Snolf into the furthest reaches of Japan's new empire, stretching their resources and their units across a geographic arc that would ultimately prove impossible to defend. The Indian Ocean represented the outer boundary of this strategic imagination. In early 1942, with British forces in the region shaken and scattered, Japanese planners glimpsed an opportunity to carry their war across the Bay of Bengal and establish footholds in territories that had never known Japanese soldiers. In March and April, Special Naval Landing Forces units participated in operations against the Andaman Islands and the Nicobar Islands, British colonial possessions that lay in the very mouth of the Bay of Bengal, positioned as if to guard the approaches to India itself. These operations were not major in terms of force commitment, but they were symbolically enormous. The islands had been lightly defended. Japanese forces arrived, established positions, and withdrew, but the message was unmistakable. Japan's reach now extended all the way to the threshold of British India. The psychological impact in Tokyo was intoxicating. Here was proof that Japan was not merely an Asian power. It was a force that could project strength across entire ocean basins, threatening the very heartland of the British Empire in the Far East. For the SENL-F officers and men involved in these operations, however, the experience was more prosaic. They had seized distant outposts with minimal resistance, established supply depots and small garrisons, and then moved on to the next objective. While some SENL-F units were operating in the Indian Ocean, others were consolidating positions throughout New Guinea, an island of staggering size and utterly unforgiving terrain that would come to define the character of the Pacific War itself. New Guinea was not primarily a naval landing force theater. The bulk of the fighting there would fall to the Imperial Japanese Army, but the SENL-F presence was vital nonetheless, particularly in the preliminary phases of conquest. Special naval landing forces companies and platoons were used to seize coastal positions, establish beachheads, and drive inland sufficiently to allow follow-on army units to land and conduct the grinding land campaign that New Guinea demanded. The operations in New Guinea during 1942 had a different character from the rapid seizures in the Dutch East Indies. The terrain was horrific, jungle so thick that men could see no more than a few paces ahead, rivers that rose without warning, and a climate that was actively hostile to human survival. It was not the kind of warfare for which the SNOF had been trained or equipped, yet they adapted, because there was no alternative. Officers learned that speed and audacity could partially compensate for terrain, that small amphibious landings behind enemy positions could unsettle opposition out of proportion to the actual numbers involved, and that the culture of aggressive advance that had served them so well in the early campaigns could, with modification, still generate tactical advantage, even in the worst conditions imaginable. But even as the SENL-F spread across the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean, reaching towards some imagined geographical limit of Japanese power, a far more serious problem was developing within the Japanese High Command itself. The Navy and the Army had never been close partners. Their institutional cultures were different, their strategic visions were fundamentally misaligned, and their competition for resources and influence within the government was a constant source of friction. The Navy's strategy, particularly as articulated by commanders like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Admiral Osamu Nagano, rested on the creation of what they called an absolute defense line, a perimeter of fortified islands and naval bases stretching from the Kurils in the north through the central Pacific and down to the East Indies. The Navy believed that if this perimeter could be held, enemy invasion fleets could be shattered by coordinated naval and air action before they ever reached Japanese home territory. The Army, by contrast, had different priorities. The Army looked westward and northward, toward China, which was still unconquered despite years of fighting, and toward the Soviet Union, which remained an existential threat on the Asian mainland. The Army believed that the Navy's island strategy was wasteful, that too many resources and too much attention were being devoted to remote Pacific territories that had no inherent strategic value except in the most abstract sense. This fundamental disagreement between two branches of the military that should have been working in harmony created a strategic schizophrenia that would haunt Japanese planning for the remainder of the war. The CENLF found itself caught directly in the middle of this institutional conflict. The Navy controlled the CENLF, used it as the cutting edge of its defensive perimeter strategy, and poured resources into expanding its size and capability. Yet the Army, which had its own amphibious formations, and which controlled the majority of Japan's ground forces, saw the CENLF as a competitor rather than a partner. The Army wanted its own dedicated amphibious units, rather than relying on the Navy for coastal assault support. This rivalry meant that training standards varied, doctrines were sometimes contradictory, and joint operations, when they did occur, suffered from coordination problems that a unified command structure might have prevented. More fundamentally, the inter-service friction meant that strategic decisions were often compromised. When the Navy wanted to reinforce an island position, the Army sometimes refused to spare the troops. When Army units needed naval gunfire support, Navy resources were sometimes unavailable because they were committed to other operations. This was not merely a matter of bureaucratic inefficiency, it was a structural pathology that would cost lives and opportunities throughout the war. The reach across the Indian Ocean and into New Guinea also exposed growing logistical strain that Tokyo's war planners had perhaps not fully appreciated. The supply lines from Japan were extending across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Every ton of ammunition, every jar of food, every medical supply, every replacement weapon had to travel these vast distances. And as American submarines grew more aggressive and American air power more capable, the journey became progressively more dangerous. Japanese merchant shipping, which was never abundant, began to take casualties. The loss rate of transport vessels accelerated through the summer and autumn of 1942. The garrisons on distant islands began reporting shortages, not yet critical, but notable enough to cause concern among commanders who understood that supply problems were the invisible foundation upon which military capability rested. The CENLF units, scattered across multiple theaters and tasked with establishing and holding positions across an enormous geographic area, began to feel the effects of these supply difficulties. Units that should have been at full strength operated under strength. The rhythm of replacement and rotation that had worked smoothly in early 1942 began to falter. Men who should have been rotated home to training billets remained on the islands. Wounded, who might have been evacuated, were sometimes held at their posts because transport capacity was insufficient. Yet in the middle months of 1942, the full gravity of the situation was not yet apparent to most of Japan's military leadership. The Great Defeat at Midway in June 1942 had been a shock, but in some circles, it was interpreted as a setback rather than a fundamental reversal. The Navy had lost 4 carriers, yes, but Japan still possessed powerful carrier forces, and the Army could make up for carrier losses through the construction of new warships and the deployment of land-based air power. The strategic perimeter, though it had clearly been damaged, could still be held, or so many believed. The reality, which would only become obvious months or years later, was that Midway had fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the war. Japan had lost the capacity to replace its losses in experienced pilots and trained carrier crews. The United States, by contrast, had the industrial capacity to replace its losses many times over, but this reality had not yet penetrated the consciousness of Japanese commanders, and the work of establishing and fortifying the defensive perimeter continued throughout the summer and autumn of 1942, with barely a pause. The SENLF units that had been deployed across the Pacific and Indian Ocean were, by the standards of the time, among the best soldiers Japan could field. Their training was rigorous, their discipline was absolute, and their willingness to fight to the last man was not merely a slogan, but a genuine reflection of their deeply internalized military culture. When they captured an island, they did not simply occupy it. They fortified it, transformed it, and prepared to defend it with every means at their disposal. They studied the lessons of their earlier battles, particularly the encounters with American forces in the early months of the year, and they refined their defensive tactics accordingly. Officers composed detailed after-action reports, analyzing what had worked and what had not. These reports circulated among SENLF units and influenced training regimens. The Corps was learning, was adapting, was becoming more professional with each month that passed. Yet there was a growing awareness, at least among some of the more perceptive commanders, that the strategy of defending an infinite perimeter with limited resources might be mathematically impossible. How many islands could be held? How many troops would be required? At what point did the perimeter become so large that the center collapsed from lack of support? The operations across the Indian Ocean and in New Guinea also provided a striking demonstration of the difference between amphibious assault and amphibious defense. The SENLF had proven extraordinarily capable at the offensive phase. The seizure of positions from a defending enemy who was often surprised and frequently outmaneuvered. But holding those positions once they had been seized presented a different set of problems entirely. An island garrison could not rely on mobility or maneuver as they did during an assault. They were committed to a specific piece of ground, and their ability to influence the outcome of a battle was constrained by the perimeter they were obligated to defend. The defensive battles that lay ahead would demand endurance, tactical flexibility, and above all, the capacity to absorb enormous casualties without breaking. These were not qualities that offensive forces naturally developed. The SENLF had been built and trained as an instrument of conquest, and while their fundamental qualities, courage, discipline, technical competence, would serve them well in defense, their doctrinal framework was fundamentally oriented toward the attack. The period from spring to autumn of 1942 thus represents a pivotal juncture in the history of the SENLF. The force had achieved everything it had been designed to achieve. It had seized control of enormous territories across the Pacific and into Southeast Asia. It had demonstrated that Japanese military power was capable of projecting strength across vast oceanic distances. It had created the physical foundation upon which the strategic defensive perimeter would rest. Yet even as these achievements were being celebrated in Tokyo, even as the maps were being updated to show the new territories under Japanese control, the fundamental preconditions for that success were beginning to erode. The American industrial machine was ramping up production. The American Navy, shocked by the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent defeats, was beginning to recover and reconstitute itself. American commanders were learning from their early defeats, analyzing Japanese tactics, and developing countermeasures. And within the Japanese military itself, the institutional friction between the Navy and the Army was growing worse, not better, creating a strategic environment in which neither service was fully committed to supporting the other's operations. The furthest reach of the Japanese Empire had been achieved, what no one could yet see, but what would become brutally obvious over the months ahead, was that the tide was already beginning to turn. The SENLF units scattered across the Indian Ocean and New Guinea, establishing garrisons and fortifying positions through the summer and autumn of 1942, were not yet aware that the age of Japanese expansion was ending. They were not yet conscious that the next time they would conduct a major amphibious assault would be, in most cases, the last time. The institutional knowledge they were accumulating, the tactical refinements they were developing, the doctrinal lessons they were drawing from their operations, all of this would be applied not to further conquests, but to desperate defensive battles against an enemy that would grow progressively more powerful and more sophisticated with each passing month. The islands that were being seized and fortified during this period would become the graves of those who held them. The supply lines that were beginning to strain in late 1942 would, within a year, be almost completely severed by American submarines and aircraft. The confidence that filled Tokyo's war rooms in the middle months of 1942 would give way, slowly at first, and then with accelerating momentum, to a growing recognition that the war was not going to be won, and that survival itself would become the only realistic objective. Yet for now, in the spring and summer of 1942, the Senelef continued its work across the furthest reaches of the Japanese Empire, building the vast defensive structure that they believed would hold back the tide forever. In the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the apex of its power. 6 months had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor, and in that time, the Special Naval Landing Forces had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia like a tide that seemed incapable of ebbing. Wake Island had fallen. Guam had been seized. The Dutch East Indies were in Japanese hands. The oil fields of Borneo flowed toward Japanese refineries. The conquest of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere appeared not merely inevitable, but almost complete. In Tokyo, and in the fleet anchorages scattered across the Japanese Empire, there existed a confidence bordering on euphoria, a sense that the war's outcome was already determined, that American industrial capacity and distance could never overcome the combination of Japanese naval superiority, tactical brilliance, and the warrior spirit that flowed through every Japanese soldier and sailor. Into this atmosphere of seeming invincibility came Operation MI, the plan to seize Midway Atoll and extend Japanese defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific. The operation carried within it all the assumptions of Japanese military dominance, and it would explode those assumptions into fragments. The Senelef's role in the Midway operation was precise and, from the Japanese perspective, straightforward. Attached to Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet were approximately 5,000 Japanese naval landing troops, soldiers drawn from the elite formations that had conquered the Dutch East Indies and seized positions across New Guinea. These men were not meant to fight their way onto Midway. They were meant to garrison it after the Imperial Navy's overwhelming superiority had crushed whatever American naval forces remained in the Pacific. The plan itself reflected an almost casual confidence in naval supremacy. The Japanese Navy would locate the American fleet carriers, destroy them in a coordinated series of airstrikes, and then the landing forces would come ashore on the smoking, conquered atoll. The Senelef troops were prepared with supplies, ammunition, and fortification materials, everything necessary to transform Midway into a forward bastion of the Japanese defensive line. The men themselves were veterans of the conquests in the South Pacific. Many had fought in Shanghai. Many carried the psychological certainty that they had never lost a battle and would never lose one. They believed, as the Navy itself believed, that their presence as garrison troops was merely a formality, a ceremonial coda to a victory already assured by naval gunfire and carrier aircraft. The Naval Battle of Midway began on the 3rd of June, 1942, and from the initial moments, it unfolded in ways radically different from what Japanese planners had anticipated. American carrier pilots, benefiting from intelligence about Japanese intentions and from the positioning of their own task forces, attacked the Japanese carrier force with a coordination and ferocity that caught Japanese commanders unprepared. Dive bombers plunged from the cloud cover and struck with terrible accuracy. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, three of Japan's first-line fleet carriers, erupted in flames. Minutes later, a fourth carrier, the Hiryu, was fatally damaged. By the afternoon of the 4th of June, the naval engagement that was supposed to secure Japanese hegemony over the Pacific had instead inflicted a blow from which the Japanese Navy would never fully recover. The loss of those four carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the loss of more than 200 experienced naval aviators and several hundred skilled air crews. It represented the loss of 5 years of Japanese naval aviation superiority. More subtly, it represented a profound shift in the balance of naval power between Japan and the United States. That shift was invisible to the 5,000 Senelef troops waiting aboard their transport vessels, but it was absolute. As news of the naval defeat filtered through the Japanese fleet, the impossible became suddenly and terrifyingly real. There would be no operation to seize Midway. There would be no landing. The American fleet, battered but unbroken, remained unconquered. The garrison troops who had been equipped and trained and mentally prepared to land on a conquered atoll and build fortifications found instead that there was no atoll to garrison. More profoundly, the entire strategic assumption that had guided Japanese planning since the beginning of the war, that the Imperial Navy was dominant and would remain so, lay shattered on the floor of the Pacific. The Snulf soldiers aboard their transports understood, perhaps not immediately, but very quickly, that the war had fundamentally changed. The offensive momentum that had carried Japan from triumph to triumph now reversed itself. The Japanese war machine, which had been designed for expansion and conquest, would now have to be redesigned for something else entirely, for defense, for holding ground, for the grinding attrition of holding positions against superior enemy forces. The immediate aftermath of Midway created a period of strategic paralysis in Japanese military planning. The Navy and the Army had fundamentally different visions of how to proceed. The Navy, having been checked in its bid for absolute dominance over the Central Pacific, proposed a fallback strategy of establishing and holding a series of outer defensive positions, islands and atolls, that would bleed American forces through repeated amphibious assaults, and eventually force the Americans to negotiate. This strategy assumed that American casualties would eventually exceed American political tolerance. It assumed, in other words, that the American people would eventually demand peace. The Army, by contrast, was far more pessimistic. Many senior Army officers recognized that the loss at Midway had ended Japan's capacity to dictate the terms of the war. They began to advocate for a more aggressive strategy of establishing strong island positions and using them to inflict sufficient casualties that the Americans would be forced to accept a negotiated settlement. But there was no true strategic consensus. Japan had lost the initiative. From this point forward, nearly every strategic move would be reactive, a response to where the Americans chose to strike, not a forward thrust of Japanese choosing. It was in this uncertain and unsettled strategic environment that the American Pacific Command made its decision to strike at the Solomon Islands. Operation Watchtower, the American amphibious assault on Guadalcanal and nearby islands, would begin in August of 1942. For the Senelf, this operation would mark a turning point every bit as significant as Midway itself, though in a different way. The naval infantry, who had been prepared to garrison a conquered Midway, would instead find themselves defending positions that they had not chosen, against enemies they had underestimated, in a campaign that would be neither brief nor glorious. The Special Naval Landing Forces had been designed and trained to execute rapid amphibious assaults in support of Japanese naval operations. They had been optimized for speed, coordination with naval gunfire, and the exploitation of Japanese naval superiority. None of these conditions would obtain in what was coming. Instead, they would find themselves in a grinding war of attrition on islands where Japanese naval superiority could not be guaranteed, where supplies were uncertain, and where the enemy would bring overwhelming force to bear. The implications of Midway for the Senulf went far deeper than mere tactical adjustment. The battle had revealed something fundamental about the nature of modern warfare that Japanese military culture had been reluctant to accept. Naval air power, not battleship armadas or amphibious shock troops, had become the arbiter of Pacific warfare. The brilliant coordination and tactical execution that had characterized Senulf operations in the South Pacific meant nothing if the Japanese Navy could not protect the supply lines that sustained those troops. The battle doctrine that emphasized rapid seizure of enemy positions and consolidation before the enemy could respond depended entirely on the assumption that Japanese naval forces would provide cover and support. Once that assumption was shattered, the entire theoretical foundation of Senulf operations began to crack. Officers and planners began to understand, even if they could not articulate it clearly, that the war had entered a new phase. The age of offensive naval infantry operations had ended. The age of defensive garrison warfare, of holding positions against superior enemy forces, of fighting to the last man on islands chosen by the enemy, that age was just beginning. In the weeks following Midway, Japanese commanders undertook a comprehensive reassessment of their defensive strategy. The concept of the island fortress, heavily fortified positions that would exact an unbearable price from attacking American forces, began to take shape in Japanese planning. The Senulf would not be merely garrison troops holding lightly fortified positions. They would become the core of a new doctrine of island defense, where fortifications would be deep and interconnected, where supplies would be cached and rationed for prolonged defense, where every man would be expected to fight to absolute exhaustion or death. This transformation in doctrine did not happen overnight. It evolved through a series of engagements at Tulagi, at Makin, at Tarawa, each one teaching bitter lessons about what happened when Japanese troops faced the full weight of American amphibious assault. But the seed of that transformation was planted at Midway. The catastrophic loss of the 4 carriers had shown Japanese military leaders that they could no longer count on naval superiority to deliver victory. They would have to win through the courage and tenacity of individual soldiers and sailors. They would have to build fortifications so strong and devastating that even American firepower could not overcome them. The shadow of Midway fell across every subsequent sell-off operation through the remainder of the war. The men who sailed to Guadalcanal in August of 1942 carried with them the knowledge that their navy had been defeated. They did not yet understand how absolute that defeat had been, nor did they understand what its consequences would be. They still believed, many of them, that through courage and determination they could reverse the tide. They still believed that the American people would not tolerate the casualties that would be inflicted on them. They still believed, in other words, in victory. But underneath that belief, especially among the junior officers and non-commissioned officers who had studied naval operations and understood something of carrier warfare, there existed an unsettling awareness that the fundamental conditions of the war had changed. The enemy would not be conquered by superior tactics or warrior spirit alone. The enemy would have to be bled through attrition. And in a war of attrition against an enemy with access to unlimited American industrial production, Japan started from a position of structural disadvantage from which it could never recover. What made the shadow of Midway so persistent was that Japanese strategic planners never truly adapted to the new reality it created. They acknowledged the loss, they accepted the need for a defensive strategy, but they continued to operate under certain fundamental assumptions that remained rooted in the pre-Midway world. The assumption that there existed some threshold of American casualties beyond which the American people would demand peace. The assumption that Japanese soldiers could somehow compensate through superior fighting spirit for their lack of numbers and industrial capacity. The assumption that a purely military victory, though no longer possible, could still somehow be traded for a negotiated settlement that preserved something of Japanese imperial ambition. All of these assumptions were illusions. All of them would contribute to the tragedy of the Sulluff's final campaigns. The men who prepared to garrison Midway in the spring of 1942 were, in many cases, the same men who would die on Tarawa in November of 1943, their bones turned to ash in furnaces of naval bombardment that made the waterline defenses they had so carefully constructed into tombs. They were the same men who would cling to the ridges of Peleliu in the autumn of 1944, shooting from caves as American flamethrowers burned through caves and tunnels. They were the same men who would fight on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the last great battles of the war, where the mathematics of casualty were so lopsided that victory and defeat became meaningless categories. The Midway operation had been cancelled. The Snuff garrison troops who were supposed to build fortifications on a conquered atoll would instead be dispersed throughout the Pacific to build fortifications on islands they were desperately trying to hold. The war that had been designed to end in victory for Japan, swift, decisive, and overwhelming, had instead entered a new and terrible phase. It would be a war of grinding attrition, of diminishing returns, of increasing casualty rates that Japanese commanders could neither reverse nor escape. The Special Naval Landing Forces, which had emerged from the 1930s as Japan's elite amphibious instrument, would be transformed by the shock of Midway into something else entirely. A force designed not for conquest, but for sacrifice. Not for lightning assaults, but for last stands. Not for the rapid seizure of territory, but for the slow, grinding defense of ground they could not afford to lose, and would ultimately lose anyway. The shadow cast by those 4 burning carriers would extend across every subsequent year of the war, darkening the prospects of every Selenef soldier and officer who sailed into the Pacific, carrying the knowledge that the war had been lost at Midway, even though the fighting would continue for 3 more years. By the summer of 1942, the confident expansion of Japanese military power across the Pacific had begun to encounter resistance that could no longer be dismissed. The string of swift victories that had characterized the opening 6 months of the war, the seizure of Guam, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, and the penetration deep into the waters of the South Pacific, had created an impression that Japanese amphibious forces were nearly invincible. Yet these early triumphs had come against enemies who were either caught by surprise, lacked naval support, or were defending territory they could not hope to reinforce. The Americans, by contrast, were mobilizing their vast industrial capacity and beginning to move forward. What happened in August of 1942 in the Solomon Islands would fundamentally alter the calculus of the Pacific War and provide the first true test of whether the Special Naval Landing Forces could hold against a determined American counteroffensive. Tulagi, a small island in the Solomon chain, would become the crucible in which that test was forged. The Solomon Islands themselves were a geographic and strategic puzzle, a long archipelago stretching roughly 600 kilometers from northwest to southeast, with Guadalcanal, the largest landmass, but dozens of smaller islands scattered throughout the chain. Tulagi sat several kilometers north across the waters of Ngela Channel, a small but strategically positioned island that the Japanese had occupied and developed as an anchorage and seaplane base. The position was valuable because it controlled approaches to the waters through which American supplies would eventually need to flow if they intended to contest Japanese naval dominance in the region. In the months following the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese naval aviation and surface forces had used these waters almost without opposition, and the seaplane base at Tulagi had become an active node in their reconnaissance network. By mid-1942, however, American planners in the Southwest Pacific Theater had concluded that they could wait no longer before striking back. The operation that would emerge was codenamed Watchtower, and it would be launched with limited resources, incomplete intelligence, and a determination that bordered on desperation to seize the initiative from an enemy that had possessed it entirely since the war began. Commanding the American operation was Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, whose task was to land the 1st Marine Division and supporting units on Guadalcanal, while simultaneously seizing Tulagi and nearby islands with forces under the command of General Alexander Vandergrift. The assault was planned for the 4th of August, 1942, and the forces available, while larger than anything the Japanese had yet faced in the Pacific, were still vastly smaller than what the American Navy would later bring to bear in subsequent operations. On Tulagi itself, the Japanese garrison consisted of perhaps 500 naval infantry of the Special Naval Landing Forces, under the command of a captain named Yoji Okumura, supported by perhaps a handful of light guns and a few anti-aircraft pieces. These numbers were not large, but they had considerable advantages. Tulagi's rocky terrain and dense vegetation provided natural defensive positions, and the Japanese had taken time to fortify their holdings with bunkers, gun emplacements, and trench systems that covered the likely landing beaches. More importantly, the men of the SNLF understood the ethos that had been instilled in them through years of training and indoctrination. They did not fight with the expectation of surviving, but rather with the certainty that their duty was to exact an unbearable price from their enemies before that end came. The assault on Tulagi began in the early hours of the 4th of August, with naval bombardment from American destroyers and cruisers, an artillery preparation that American commanders believed would suppress Japanese defenses and inflict heavy casualties before the Marines even set foot on the island. The bombardment lasted several hours and was sufficiently intense that observers watching from the decks of American transports believed the island could not possibly harbor more than a handful of surviving defenders. Yet this confidence was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how Japanese forces, and particularly the SNLF, would respond to naval gunfire. The naval infantry had learned through their experience in China and throughout their expansion across the Pacific that the best defense against naval bombardment was to shelter in fortified positions with overhead cover, remaining quiet, and conserving strength, rather than attempting to mount an active defense against shells falling from offshore. When American Marines waded ashore in their landing craft and through the shallow waters off Tulagi's beaches, they did not encounter a demoralized or depleted enemy. Instead, they encountered disciplined fire from machine guns, rifles, and light artillery, positioned to cover the landing beaches and the narrow terrain beyond them. The Japanese defenders possessed interior knowledge of their own positions and had sighted their weapons on the approaches long before the Marines appeared. The initial assault waves suffered grievously. American casualties mounted rapidly as the Marines advanced inland. finding that the terrain made rapid movement difficult, and that every ravine, every patch of heavy jungle, and every rocky outcropping could conceal a determined Japanese defender. The Japanese had distributed their forces across the island in a way that ensured they could not be quickly overrun, and they had instilled in their troops the understanding that territorial retreat was permissible only when it served a larger purpose, when it meant falling back to more formidable defensive positions rather than simply evacuating ground. This doctrine of flexible defense in depth, learned partly through their experiences in China and against the stiffer defenses they had encountered in the Dutch East Indies, gave the small Japanese garrison a tactical sophistication that many American commanders had not anticipated. The Senelef troops on Tulagi were not simply dying to hold a line. They were fighting a calculated defensive campaign designed to inflict maximum casualties while gradually withdrawing toward a final defensive position. This understanding would have profound implications for how American military planners would come to view the Senelef throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. As the battle progressed through its first day, American forces gradually gained ground, but the pace of advance was painfully slow. By the close of that first afternoon, the Marines had secured only a portion of the island, and resistance remained fierce along a defensive line that the Japanese had prepared running across the northern section of Tulagi. That night, under cover of darkness, the Japanese attempted a counterattack, a sudden assault that emerged from the jungle against American positions that were still being consolidated. These were banzai charges in the nascent form, waves of attacking troops moving forward with bayonets fixed, shouting battle cries that were designed both to steal their own courage and to demoralize their opponents. To American Marines, most of them in combat for the first time, this form of attack was profoundly shocking. Soldiers who could lie quiet in their fortifications during artillery bombardment would suddenly erupt in violent assault, accepting that many of them would not survive the attempt, but gambling that the ferocity and surprise of their action might break American resistance. The tactic rarely succeeded in driving back American forces, but it consistently inflicted heavy casualties and created a psychological impact that American troops would report repeatedly throughout the war. The fighting on Tulagi continued for 3 days, stretching from the 4th of August through the 6th, during which time the American forces gradually compressed the remaining Japanese defenders into an increasingly small area at the northern tip of the island. The Japanese garrison was not reinforced. The waters around the Solomon Islands were contested and had begun to come under American naval and air superiority, and supplies could not reach them. As their position became hopeless, Japanese commanders made the calculations that would become routine throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Surrender was not an option recognized by either Japanese doctrine or the cultural understanding of what it meant to be Senelef. The choice, therefore, was how to fight to the last man, how to ensure that the final moments of the garrison achieved the maximum military effect and the greatest cost to the Americans. On the 7th of August, as American forces prepared for what they expected would be the final assault on the surviving Japanese positions, the remaining defenders, numbering perhaps 100 or fewer at this point, emerged from their fortifications and launched a coordinated final assault against American lines. This was not the wild, undisciplined charge that American observers sometimes portrayed it as, but rather a last attempt to establish some form of tactical effect before the inevitable end. The assault was met with overwhelming American firepower and broke apart, and with that, effective Japanese resistance on Tulagi came to an end. The casualty figures from the Battle of Tulagi told a story that would repeat again and again across the Pacific. The Japanese garrison, numbering around 500 at the beginning of the battle, lost almost 400 killed in action, with only a handful making their way to other islands or being captured. American forces suffered 99 killed and around 200 wounded, losses that were severe by the standards of small unit engagements, but that represented roughly a quarter of the Japanese casualties, despite vastly outnumbering the defenders. More significantly, from the perspective of Japanese planning, the defense of Tulagi demonstrated that even a small garrison, properly fortified and properly led, could exact an enormous price from an attacking force. American commanders and planners found themselves contemplating calculations that were deeply disturbing. If 500 Japanese troops on a small island could inflict 100 American casualties, how many Americans would it take to seize an island garrison of 5,000? What would be the cost of pushing through the entire Solomon chain, the hundreds of islands that the Japanese had fortified throughout the Pacific? These calculations would shape American planning throughout the remainder of the war and would drive the search for new technologies, new tactics, and new ways of fighting that might reduce the staggering human cost that seemed inherent in island-to-island advance. From the perspective of the Senlef and Japanese military planning more broadly, however, Tulagi carried a different meaning. The defense had been executed almost exactly as doctrine prescribed. The garrison had not folded under bombardment. It had not panicked when confronted by superior numbers. It had fought with discipline and tactical sophistication, inflicting disproportionate casualties, and had ultimately died rather than surrender. The ideal outcome from the perspective of Japanese military culture. The officers and men of the garrison had fulfilled what they understood to be their obligation, and if that obligation meant death, then death was an acceptable outcome. This mindset, sometimes characterized by outsiders as suicidal fanaticism, but which the men themselves understood as the highest expression of their duty, would become the defining characteristic of every subsequent island battle. Yet even as the Japanese celebrated the conduct of the Tulagi garrison, structural problems in their strategic position were becoming increasingly obvious. The American forces that had taken Tulagi had essentially unlimited replacements and reinforcements. Vessels from the American shipyards were replacing losses at a rate that the Japanese could not match. The garrison on Tulagi had been abandoned, left to fight alone without hope of reinforcement, because the Japanese Navy had already concluded it could not secure the Solomon chain against American naval power. The broader implications of the Tulagi operation, and particularly the simultaneous landing on Guadalcanal, were becoming evident by the end of August 1942. The Americans had demonstrated that they could conduct a multi-island amphibious operation, that they could sustain forces ashore in the face of Japanese resistance, and that they could continue to reinforce their positions even when Japanese naval forces attempted to contest their presence. The war was transitioning from the phase of Japanese conquest to the phase of American counteroffensive, and that transition was visible in the desperate fighting on Tulagi and its neighboring islands. The Snelf had proven that they could fight with extraordinary tenacity and tactical skill. What they had not proven, and what no amount of tenacity could overcome, was a capacity to reverse the fundamental balance of resources and industrial capacity that favored the United States. The small garrison on Tulagi had written their final chapter with their bodies and their blood, and in doing so, they had demonstrated both the terrible potential and the ultimate futility of the defensive strategy upon which Japan's hope for the Pacific War now rested. The lessons that both sides drew from Tulagi would resonate through every subsequent island battle. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. Existing amphibious doctrine and equipment were insufficient. Casualties were going to be devastating, and success would require massive material superiority and absolute naval dominance. The Americans would respond by investing in better landing craft, by developing underwater demolition teams to clear obstacles before assaults, by refining the coordination between naval gunfire and infantry assault, and by accepting that some operations might require weeks of intensive preparation and bombardment before troops were even committed to shore. For the Japanese, the lesson was more complex. The defense of Tulagi had vindicated their ethos of fighting to the last man, but it had also demonstrated that even perfect execution of defensive doctrine could not overcome massive numerical and material disadvantages. Yet Japanese planners and commanders, drawing conclusions from Tulagi and the simultaneous operations around Guadalcanal, would double down on the defensive fortress strategy, reinforcing subsequent garrisons more heavily and attempting to prepare fortifications that were even more elaborate and more deeply protected than those at Tulagi. These decisions, made in the autumn of 1942, would shape the next 3 years of the Pacific War and would ultimately lead to some of the most brutal and destructive battles of the entire conflict. In the dim hours before the tropical dawn on the 17th of August, 1942, a small detachment of American Marines descended from their transport ships into the dark waters north of Makin Atoll. These were the Marine Raiders, a unit born from American military urgency and experimental thinking, designed to strike rapidly across the Pacific and prove that the initiative could swing back toward the United States, even as Japanese forces seemed to dominate every battlefield. The raid on Makin was meant to be swift and surgical. Land, destroy Japanese installations, kill what enemy soldiers you found, and withdraw before any serious Japanese response could form. What would unfold instead was a confused, chaotic firefight that neither side fully understood in the moment, but whose consequences would reverberate across every Japanese island garrison, from the Gilbert Islands to the Marshall to Saipan itself. The small Japanese force at Makin, fewer than 400 men of the Special Naval Landing Forces and supporting troops, would hold their ground with the ferocity that had become the signature of naval infantry under fire, and their defense, though ultimately overwhelmed, would trigger a seismic shift in how Japan thought about defending its scattered empire. Makin Atoll itself was not strategically vital, and therein lay much of its psychological importance. It sat in the Gilbert Islands, several hundred kilometers northwest of Tarawa, a relatively minor outpost of Japanese presence in a region that seemed, to American planners, ripe for the kind of small-scale raiding operations that could generate propaganda victories and test new amphibious tactics without committing massive resources. The atoll was low-lying, ringed with coral, studded with sparse vegetation, and home to a small seaplane base and administrative facilities that the Japanese had only lightly garrisoned. The Senov detachment there, under the command of a naval officer, had received no warning of the American approach. Intelligence had failed on both sides. The Americans believed the garrison to be perhaps 50 men, when in fact, closer to 400 were present. For the Japanese, the appearance of enemy warships on their horizon came as a shock from clear sky, a sudden rupture in the apparent security of their interior lines. The Marine Raiders who hit the beaches came under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Evans Fordyce Carlson, a controversial and visionary officer who had studied guerrilla warfare in China and returned to the Marine Corps, convinced that small units of highly trained, motivated men could strike deep and strike hard against Japanese positions. Carlson's approach emphasized speed, audacity, and close-quarters marksmanship, virtues that would later become foundational to the American amphibious doctrine. His men were volunteers, many of them veterans of other small operations, and they possessed an aggressive confidence that made them fundamentally different from the cautious, methodical approach that had characterized much of American military thinking in the Pacific War's opening months. What they lacked, however, was clear intelligence about what they would actually face on Macon, and that gap between expectation and reality would shape the entire operation. The Self garrison, surprised but refusing to break, did what Japanese naval infantry had been trained to do. They fought. Without reinforcement, without the possibility of relief, without strategic mobility, they held their positions and made the Americans pay for every meter of ground. The defense unfolded in broken terrain, across coconut groves, and through the settlement itself, in a pattern that would become grimly familiar as the Pacific War advanced. Small groups of Japanese soldiers would establish fighting positions, pour fire on the advancing Americans, fall back when threatened with encirclement, and establish new positions further inland, a dance of resistance and tactical withdrawal that was coordinated enough to inflict casualties, but ultimately futile against an opponent with greater firepower and reinforcements arriving offshore. The battle lasted for days, and the fighting was often at close quarters, in the American style that Carlson had trained his men to execute. Japanese soldiers died in trenches and behind improvised fortifications. Some fought until ammunition ran out, then fought with bayonets. Others attempted to escape through the lagoon or into the surrounding islands, seeking to evade capture or to link up with other Japanese forces. By the time the Americans finally secured the atoll and withdrew after 3 days ashore, the Snulf garrison had been almost entirely annihilated. What made Macon consequential, however, was not the tactical execution, which both sides would later recognize as confused and improvised, but rather the way it shattered something in Japanese strategic planning. The Americans had struck at an interior island, demonstrating that no Japanese possession in the Central Pacific was truly secure from American amphibious power. More troubling still was the raid itself. It was small, it was impudent. It was exactly the kind of operation that suggested the Americans possessed mobility and initiative that Japanese plans had not adequately anticipated. Carlson's men had come from the sea, struck a garrison, fought for ground, and then vanished back into the ocean. It was not a conventional battle in the large-scale sense, but it was a sign of things to come, a proof of concept for the kind of aggressive American strategy that would accelerate as American industrial output converted into actual combat power in the Pacific. The impact on Japanese planning was immediate and dramatic. Officers at Imperial headquarters and across the scattered island garrisons understood that Macon represented a new threat profile. The Americans were not just going to wage large-scale fleet battles or methodical campaigns to recapture territory. They would conduct raids, harassing operations, and small amphibious assaults against positions thought to be safe. This realization triggered a frantic reassessment of defensive requirements across every Japanese-held atoll and island in the Central Pacific. Commanders who had been content with relatively modest garrisons suddenly found themselves confronted with orders to reinforce, fortify, and prepare for an enemy capable of striking from the sea with little warning. The garrisons that had been scattered thinly across hundreds of islands, sufficient perhaps for administrative control, but inadequate for serious defense, now began to swell with reinforcements. Engineers were dispatched to build bunkers and fortifications. Artillery units were moved into position. Supply lines were stretched further and further to keep these increasingly muscular garrisons adequately provisioned. The strategic consequences of this shift could not be measured immediately, but they were profound. The Macon raid crystallized something else in Japanese military thinking. A conviction that the defense of islands would require not merely courage and determination, but systematic, scientifically organized fortification, and a willingness to make the cost of amphibious assault so prohibitive that American planners would be forced to reconsider their entire strategy. Japanese engineers, studying the Makin operation and earlier American landings, began to develop a more sophisticated defensive doctrine. The principle was simple. If the enemy was coming from the sea, defend at the water's edge with everything available. Pre-positioned artillery, carefully registered on landing beaches and potential beachhead areas. Machine gun positions sited for interlocking fields of fire. Obstacles in the water and on the beach. Log barriers, anti-boat mines, wooden and concrete barricades, designed to canalize landing craft into prepared killing zones. The lessons of Tarawa that would horrify the world months later were in some sense already being written in the minds of Japanese planners responding to the shock of Makin. The actual tactical details of the Makin operation were often confused and would later be debated by historians. The Americans had landed on the wrong side of the lagoon initially, the confusion of night landing and tropical terrain making coordination difficult. The Somme-Left defense had not been coordinated in any sophisticated sense. Units fought where they stood, adapted to local circumstances, died in place. Radio communications on both sides were poor. Some Japanese defenders never engaged the Americans at all, cut off by the fluid combat situation. Some American units became lost in the coconut groves and had to fight their way back to friendly positions. The whole affair was less a demonstration of perfected military practice than a confused collision of opposing forces, each trying to navigate chaos and uncertainty. Yet from that confusion came clarity for the Japanese leadership. They could no longer assume that any island was too small or too remote to be attacked. The strategic map had changed. The propaganda value of Makin was significant for the Americans, though in ways that the planners themselves did not fully appreciate. The raid had been publicized in advance as a daring operation, an American strike deep into Japanese-held territory. When it was executed and the raiders withdrew with prisoners and intelligence, the American press trumpeted it as a victory that demonstrated the fighting quality of American Marines and the new aggressive spirit of the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese, meanwhile, were forced to acknowledge in their own military communications that an American raiding force had struck at an interior position and held it long enough to inflict serious casualties on a Snolf garrison before withdrawing. For Japanese commanders, already wrestling with the strategic implications of American industrial capacity and the growing American presence in the Pacific, Makin was a wake-up call that transcended its modest scale. The response from Japanese Imperial headquarters was to demand comprehensive reassessment of island defense strategies across the Central Pacific. The atolls and islands that had been garrisoned as administrative centers and air bases were now to be transformed into fortified bastions, each capable of resisting sustained amphibious assault. This was not a small undertaking. It required the movement of thousands of troops, the commitment of engineering resources that were increasingly scarce, the creation of supply lines that strained the already fragile Japanese logistics network. Young soldiers, many of them conscripted civilians pressed into military service, found themselves shipped to islands across the Central Pacific to dig bunkers, fell coconut palms for fortifications, and prepare to die defending atoll after atoll for a homeland they might never see. The Senel-F units that would garrison these islands were reinforced, expanded, and given new equipment designed for the specific demands of island defense against American amphibious assault. The doctrine that emerged from the Makin reassessment was one of depth and determination. Rather than a thin line of defense, Japanese commanders began to organize their island garrisons into multiple lines of resistance, each designed to inflict casualties and slow the American advance. Machine gun positions were dug into concrete bunkers capable of withstanding naval bombardment. Artillery was sighted and carefully registered. Tank traps and anti-landing craft obstacles were positioned in the surf and on the beaches. Every atoll became a potential fortress, every garrison a potential anvil against which American amphibious assault would break. The assumption that had guided much of Japanese planning in the first months of the Pacific War, that speed of conquest and the mystique of Japanese military prowess would discourage serious American counteroffensive action, had been shattered. Now Japan would have to prepare for a war of attrition on islands, a war in which Japanese soldiers would be asked to hold impossible positions against overwhelming odds. For the small San-left detachment at Makin, the operation had meant death, almost complete annihilation as a unit. But their sacrifice, if we may use that word for men ordered to hold ground they could not hold, was not meaningless in the calculus of strategic consequence. The raid had triggered a cascade of responses that would consume enormous Japanese resources in the months to come, resources that might have been devoted to fleet operations or defense of the home islands. More subtly, the Makin raid had demonstrated that the American amphibious machine, though still crude and imperfect, was capable of generating strategic shock even when wielded in limited operations by relatively small forces. The confidence that had characterized Japanese military planning in the year after Pearl Harbor had been further eroded. The Americans were not merely defending against Japanese expansion, they were planning for American expansion, and that expansion would begin, from Makin onward, with the systematic fortification of every Japanese position in the Central Pacific and the desperate preparation for battles that Japanese commanders already suspected they could not win. By the autumn of 1942, something fundamental had shifted in how Japan's military leadership understood its predicament in the Pacific. The early conquests had come with startling speed and at remarkably low cost, but the loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway, 4 months earlier, had shattered the illusion of inevitable victory. What remained was the terrible clarity of a prolonged war against an enemy whose industrial capacity was virtually limitless. The Japanese Navy and the special naval landing forces that served it could no longer afford to think of the Pacific as an arena to be conquered through swift offensive strokes. Instead, they would have to transform the very islands they occupied into weapons themselves. They would build fortresses. They would create a defensive barrier so costly to breach that perhaps, just perhaps, American willingness to pay the price in blood might fracture. This was born the Island Fortress Doctrine, and with it came the most intensive engineering campaign the Japanese military had yet undertaken. The strategic logic was almost surgical in its clarity. Japan could not match American shipbuilding or aircraft production. It could not compete in a war of attrition fought across open ocean, but it could make the enemy come to them. It could prepare the killing ground in advance. It could force every American unit that attempted a landing to fight on terrain meticulously prepared for defense against fortifications that had been studied and refined and layered with overlapping fields of fire. The architects of this strategy understood, with a frankness that sometimes bordered on pessimism, that Japan was no longer fighting for empire, but for survival. Each atoll that could be held longer, each beachhead that cost the Americans more casualties, each week of delay in the enemy's advance, was a week in which something might happen to change the equation. Japan might develop new weapons. The American people might lose their appetite for endless bloodshed. The war's outcome might somehow be negotiated, rather than dictated by total defeat. These were hopes, perhaps desperate ones, but they were the hopes that drove the fortress-building campaign that now began in earnest across the Central Pacific. The transformation started on islands that would become synonymous with horror in the coming months and years. Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, A sprawling coral formation barely more than 3 miles long, and in places only a few hundred yards wide, became a laboratory for this new approach. Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, another atoll, surrounded by treacherous reef and shallow lagoon, received similar attention. Dozens of smaller atolls and island outposts across the Gilbert and Marshall chains were fortified simultaneously, each one receiving the peculiar expertise that only a military organization working without time constraints could muster. Engineers arrived first, often accompanied by thousands of conscripted laborers, drawn from occupied territories and from Japan itself. These men would spend weeks in the equatorial heat, often in conditions of near starvation, carving bunkers from coral rock, pouring concrete, building gun emplacements and ammunition magazines, digging tunnels that would connect the various fortress positions into an integrated defensive network. The work was exhausting, sometimes lethal, and conducted under the permanent shadow of American air raids and submarine attacks. The engineering principles themselves represented a striking evolution from the waterline defense strategy that had dominated Japanese thinking even months earlier. Officers who had studied the costly lessons of every failed or partial American assault on Japanese-held islands now understood that the old doctrine had been fundamentally flawed. You could not defend against modern artillery and aircraft with men standing at the beach awaiting the enemy's arrival. You needed depth. You needed multiple layers of defense, each one capable of inflicting casualties on the attacker, each one positioned so that attacking forces could not bypass it without being cut down from alternate positions. The bunkers were constructed from reinforced concrete whenever possible, sometimes built into the natural contours of the island itself, with overlapping fields of fire that had been calculated in advance. Connecting trenches and tunnels allowed defenders to move between positions without exposure to direct fire. Artillery pieces were dug in and pre-ranged, their firing coordinates carefully marked so that fire could be delivered with precision, even in darkness or reduced visibility. Anti-landing obstacles were placed both on the beach and in the shallow water offshore, designed to slow any assault and channel attacking forces into prepared killing zones. What made this fortress doctrine particularly fearsome was not any single innovation, but rather the integration of all these elements into a coherent whole. A Japanese lieutenant commander named Shibasaki, who would later command the garrison at Tarawa, summarized this philosophy with stark simplicity. The Americans would have to come across open water and then across reef to reach the island. The first obstacles would slow them. The coastal defense guns and machine gun positions would decimate them in the approach. If any reached the beach, they would face interlocking fields of fire from multiple prepared positions. If they attempted to outflank one position, they would be enfiladed from another. Every square yard of the island's surface had been studied, measured, and incorporated into the overall defense plan. There was no mercy in this thinking, no allowance for anything but maximum casualties inflicted on the attacker. The labor force that built these fortresses represented one of the war's great tragedies, largely unheralded in Western histories. Thousands of conscripted workers arrived on these remote atolls from Korea, Okinawa, and other occupied territories, along with impressed laborers from the islands themselves. They dug the rock with primitive tools. They mixed concrete by hand in the equatorial heat. They carried ammunition and supplies through tunnels, sometimes barely tall enough to crouch through. The Japanese military command provided minimal supplies and showed little regard for their welfare. Disease was rampant, the food was meager, men collapsed from heat stroke and heat exhaustion regularly. The death rate among conscripted workers on these islands reached appalling levels, sometimes exceeding the percentage of combat casualties. Few records were kept, few names were recorded. These men simply vanished into the work. their contribution literally buried in the concrete and coral of fortifications they would never see completed. When the Americans came, many of these laborers would be trapped on the islands with no means of escape, caught between two fires with no protection and no recognition. Their deaths, when they came, would be among the most terrible of the war. Japanese soldiers themselves did not escape the physical toll of the fortress-building campaign. Combat troops and engineers worked alongside conscripted laborers, often in comparable conditions. The Navy's special landing forces carried the additional burden of the doctrine they had themselves helped to create. They knew that when the Americans came, the men who would hold these fortresses would be expected to hold them until death. There was no strategy of withdrawal, no plan for organized retreat. The doctrine of the fortress was the doctrine of the grave. Every man assigned to garrison duty on an atoll understood, whether through explicit order or through the broader culture of absolute obedience and dishonor in surrender, that his island post was likely to be his last. This knowledge infused the work with a grim intensity. Men labored knowing they were building their own tombs. The technical sophistication of the fortifications should not be understated. The Japanese had learned from studying American amphibious assaults against other positions. They understood the role of naval gunfire support in softening defenses before troops hit the beach. They knew the pattern of American assault waves, the intervals between bombardment and landing. Against these known factors, they planned countermeasures. The bunkers were positioned to survive naval bombardment. Secondary positions were prepared to remain functional, even if primary defenses were destroyed. Artillery was distributed so that even if significant numbers of guns were destroyed, sufficient firepower would remain to engage landing craft and beach. Gun crews practiced their firing drills endlessly. Radar installations were placed to give warning of incoming aircraft. Anti-aircraft positions were integrated into the overall defensive plan. The engineers even attempted to design fortifications that would be difficult for advancing troops to destroy without suffering heavy casualties, incorporating angles and approaches that would force attackers into close-quarters combat, where the defender's prepared position gave the strongest advantage. The scale of this undertaking, across dozens of islands, simultaneously represented an extraordinary logistical achievement by the Japanese military, particularly impressive given the constraints under which it operated. Supply ships had to navigate waters increasingly dangerous from American submarine activity. Fuel was limited, heavy equipment was in short supply, yet somehow the materials arrived. Concrete was mixed, steel reinforcement was embedded in fortifications, ammunition was stockpiled in cavernous magazines, coastal defense guns were emplaced. The fact that so much was accomplished under such adverse circumstances spoke to a remarkable mobilization of resources and human effort. It also spoke to a military culture that had embraced its fortress strategy with almost religious fervor, understanding that this was the final throw of the dice. If the fortifications failed, Japan had nothing else left. The doctrine itself represented an implicit acknowledgement of defeat, disguised in the language of determined resistance. The Japanese High Command was no longer speaking of defeating America in open warfare. They were no longer discussing how Japan might maintain and expand its Pacific perimeter. They were instead planning how to impose such a terrible price on American advances that perhaps, somehow, the equation might change. Perhaps, if enough young American men died on coral atolls, if the casualty figures shocked the American public, if the cost became unbearable, then negotiations might become possible. This was not hope based on military logic, but hope born of desperation. Yet it was the only hope Japan had left, and so the digging continued. The concrete was poured, and thousands of men prepared themselves to stand on islands and fight and die. knowing that death was the only possible outcome. By the spring of 1943, the fortress-building campaign had reached a kind of completion across the central Pacific islands that would face American assault first. The outer islands were as ready as Japanese engineering and labor could make them. The defensive doctrine had been codified, refined, and disseminated through detailed orders and tactical directives to garrison commanders. Supplies had been stockpiled, as much as dwindling logistics would permit. The men assigned to these garrisons had trained in the use of their weapons and understood the interconnected defensive plan. What none of them could have foreseen with absolute certainty was how quickly and completely the new American amphibious machine would overwhelm these carefully prepared positions, nor how even the most meticulously constructed fortress would prove vulnerable to an enemy willing to pay any price and possessing resources that seemed without limit. The fortress doctrine would buy time. It would exact a terrible toll on American assault troops, but it would not, ultimately, turn the tide. It would instead become a monument to Japanese courage in the face of inevitable defeat, purchased at a price in human suffering that extended far beyond the soldiers who held the fortifications. The labor gangs that had built these islands into fortresses received different fates depending on their nationality and their location. Those conscripted from Japanese territories were sometimes incorporated into combat units and fought alongside regular troops. Others were killed in bombing raids that preceded American landings. Some attempted to flee to outlying islands and were lost at sea. Those conscripted from occupied territories and from the islands themselves often had no choice but to remain, and when the fighting came, many were trapped in the crossfire, killed by artillery and naval gunfire from both sides, or executed by Japanese forces under orders to eliminate potential sympathizers and witnesses. A few managed to hide and survive, later to be discovered by advancing American forces, often bewildered, malnourished, and traumatized by the violence they had endured. But the vast majority vanished into the rubble of the fortifications they had built. Their names are largely unknown. Their suffering is largely unremembered, yet they represent an essential part of the island fortress story, the human cost of turning coral atolls into weapons. What would emerge from the fortress-building campaign was perhaps the most profoundly altered landscape of war in the entire Pacific conflict. The atolls became things that had never existed before in human warfare. Small pieces of land transformed through engineering, labor, and the deliberate application of modern military science into positions of extraordinary strength, designed to extract a maximum price from any attempt to take them. They stood waiting, these fortresses, as the spring of 1943 turned to summer and then to autumn. Garrison troops sat in their bunkers and tunnels, knowing with certainty that the moment of testing would come. The question that hung over every position was not whether the Americans would come, but how long and at what cost the islands could hold. That question would soon receive answers written in blood across the coral reefs of the Central Pacific. In the autumn of 1943, the Pacific War reached a crucial threshold. The Japanese had lost the strategic initiative at Midway, ceded the Solomons to a grinding American advance, and watched their outer perimeter shrink month by month. But they had not accepted defeat. Instead, a new doctrine was hardening across the empire's remaining island garrisons. The idea that each atoll, each strip of coral and sand, would be held as a fortress, and nowhere would this philosophy be tested more savagely than on a small, rain-sodden island called Betio, the largest of the Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. By November 1943, Tarawa had become a name that would alter the course of the Pacific War, not through a Japanese victory, but through the terrible price of American victory and the lessons written in blood that would reshape how amphibious warfare was fought for generations to come. The island itself was almost impossibly cramped. Betio measured only 2 miles in length and half a mile at its widest point, a thin crescent of sand and coral that seemed to promise a quick operation for American planners. The garrison was not enormous. Roughly 4,700 sailors and soldiers of the Special Naval Landing Forces and supporting troops, under the command of a determined officer named Major Shibasaki. What made Betio a fortress was not its size, but its preparation. For months, work parties had labored under a punishing sun to transform this fragment of coral into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of real estate on the planet. Nearly 500 bunkers and strongpoints studded the lagoon-facing shore, walls of reinforced concrete 3 feet thick, coconut logs piled in layers and topped with sand. Anti-tank obstacles studded the reef, anti-boat guns and machine gun nests interlocked to create overlapping fields of fire. The garrison had studied every American amphibious operation, Guadalcanal, Gela, Attu, and they had learned. They were ready. The American expedition that sailed toward Tarawa in November 1943 was commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, the same officer whose fleet had achieved victory at Midway. Under his command was the United States 2nd Marine Division, nearly 18,000 strong, led by Major General Julian Smith. The Marines carried with them a confidence born of months in the Pacific and a belief that their superiority in numbers and firepower would quickly overwhelm any island garrison. American naval gunfire was expected to pulverize Betio in advance of the landing. American air power would strip away any Japanese resistance. The assault would be quick, clean, and decisive, or so the planning assumed. What the Americans did not fully grasp was that they were about to encounter a garrison that had prepared itself not to win, but to exact a price so terrible that the cost of conquering the Pacific would become a question that haunted the nation, sending its sons to pay it. The bombardment began on the morning of the 20th of November. For hours, American battleships and cruisers hurled shells onto Betio, thousands of tons of ordnance that turned the island into a landscape of fire and ash. Observers aboard American ships watched through binoculars and reported that the island could not possibly have been left with a living thing upon it. Surely the concrete and coral were obliterated. Surely the garrison was annihilated. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The very fortifications that made Betio such a formidable position also provided shelter from the bombardment. Bunkers buried under layers of sand and logs absorbed the impact without breaking. Japanese defenders huddled in reinforced tunnels, waiting. The naval bombardment, intensive as it was, had failed in its primary purpose. It had not destroyed the Japanese defensive network. It had simply announced to every defender that the Americans were coming. The assault waves began at 08:30 in the morning, on what was scheduled to be a straightforward operation. The Marines approached the reef in landing craft, designed to carry troops across open water, but these craft drew too much water to cross the shallow lagoon at Tarawa. The assault waves grounded on the coral reef, more than 400 yards from the beach. What happened next became one of the most haunting scenes of the entire Pacific War. Marines waded through waist-deep water toward the shore, exposed and slow-moving, their rifles held high, their bodies presenting themselves to a zone of fire that was not merely organized, but devastating. From hundreds of carefully prepared firing positions, the Senleave garrison opened up with machine guns, rifled artillery, and anti-tank guns. The water around the Marines literally erupted. Men fell before they had covered half the distance. Some were shot in the head and fell forward into the water. Others were struck in the torso and simply stopped moving, dragged backward by the current. The beach ahead was defended not by a beaten and demoralized garrison, but by soldiers who had trained for exactly this moment and were prepared to spend their lives to make every yard of sand cost American blood. The first wave of Marines that made it to the beach found themselves in front of a low seawall, a natural barrier barely 3 feet high that had been reinforced with barbed wire and overlooked by a maze of gun positions. The beach itself was a killing ground. Japanese defenders had pre-ranged every distance, every approach, every likely avenue of maneuver. Casualties mounted in the minutes rather than the hours that planners had foreseen. Small groups of Marines sought shelter in the narrow space between the seawall and the water, returning fire when they could, but the defensive positions were too well prepared, too deeply entrenched, for individual bravery to break through. The Senself sailors and soldiers who manned those positions fought with an almost mechanical determination. To them, surrender was not an option. Retreat was not a concept. They had been trained to believe that to die in place was the only honorable course, and they executed that doctrine with perfect fidelity. As successive waves landed over the course of the day, the carnage accumulated. By nightfall on the 20th of November, the Marines had secured only the thin beachhead, measured in yards, rather than the hundreds of yards that operational plans had anticipated. The cost had been staggering, nearly 500 casualties in a single day to capture a sliver of beach. The Japanese garrison remained intact, dug into their fortifications, and prepared to continue the fight. That night was horrifying for the Marines trapped on that narrow beachhead. They had no room to maneuver. They had limited supplies of water and ammunition. They were under constant fire from positions they could not suppress, and the assault had not gone remotely according to plan. Reports flowing back to Admiral Spruance and General Smith painted a picture not of a garrison on the verge of collapse, but of an organized, determined enemy that would not simply evaporate under American firepower. The battle that followed unfolded over 76 hours, as stated in official records. Roughly 3 days of some of the most savage and confused fighting in the Pacific War. Each day began with ferocious bombardment from supporting cruisers and destroyers, and from the guns of the Marines themselves. Each night brought Japanese counterattacks, some frenzied and some deliberately executed at dawn, designed to drive the Americans back into the lagoon or force them to expend ammunition in defensive fire. The Senself garrison, understanding that they could not win, had chosen instead to make the battle hurt, and hurt it did. Marines clawed forward yard by yard, using flamethrowers against bunkers, grenades against defensive positions, bayonets in the hand-to-hand fighting that erupted constantly across the island. For every strong point captured, there was another hidden behind rubble and palm trees. For every Japanese position destroyed, there was a counterattack that cost American lives. The island became a chaos of smoke and noise and death, and the Marines pressed forward only because retreat was unthinkable, and because their training had prepared them to overcome the worst conditions imaginable. The Japanese command structure began to dissolve as the battle progressed. Major Shibasaki, the garrison commander, had died on the first day. Some sources suggest from artillery fire, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. What is certain is that his death broke the formal chain of command, leaving the garrison to fight in small groups, each position independent, each a tiny redoubt fighting its last stand. This fragmentation actually made the garrison more difficult to deal with in some respects. There were no orders to retreat, no coordinated defense that American artillery could disrupt. There were only hundreds of individual Japanese sailors and soldiers determined to hold their positions until they were killed. And that is precisely what happened. As the 76 hours elapsed, the Japanese garrison was annihilated, almost to a man. Of nearly 4,700 defenders, only a handful survived the battle. Most died at their gun positions, killed by flamethrowers, grenades, or rifle fire. Some died in the suicidal banzai charges that characterized the closing hours of the battle. A handful, perhaps fewer than 200, were captured, many of them too wounded to resist. The island was soaked in blood and littered with bodies, both Japanese and American. The cost to the United States 2nd Marine Division was almost incomprehensible for an operation that was supposed to be a straightforward garrison relief. Over 3,000 Marines were killed or wounded in 76 hours on an island that measured 2 miles long. Photographs of the beach showed bodies stacked like cordwood, the water stained with blood, landing craft festooned with debris and carnage. The American public, which had received accounts of the battle throughout those 3 days, reacted with shock. Yes, the island had been taken. Yes, the enemy had been killed to the last man. But at what cost? Families across America received telegrams notifying them that their sons were not coming home. Hospitals filled with wounded Marines, whose wounds were both physical and psychological, carrying with them the memory of that lagoon choked with bodies and the machine gun fire that had never stopped coming from the Japanese positions. The battle became a symbol not of American invincibility, but of the terrible price that victory in the Pacific would exact. One American general, upon examining the battlefield after the fighting ended, reportedly wept at the sight. Yet from this bloodshed came a hard education in the nature of amphibious warfare against a determined enemy. American planners and operational commanders absorbed the lessons of Tarawa with an intensity born of necessity. The naval bombardment, however intense, was insufficient on its own to destroy a well-prepared garrison. The approach through the lagoon to the beach was too vulnerable, too slow, leaving assault troops exposed for too long. The system of naval gunfire support needed to be better coordinated with the assault waves. New landing craft needed to be designed to reach across shallow lagoons without grounding on reefs. Underwater demolition needed to precede the assault to clear obstacles. Intelligence about beach conditions and tidal ranges needed to be dramatically improved. And perhaps most importantly, the psychological certainty that had characterized pre-Tarawa planning, the belief that American superiority would guarantee quick victory, needed to be replaced by a more sober understanding that Japanese garrisons would fight with an intensity and determination that demanded the best that American innovation and courage could produce. Over the following months, every one of these lessons was implemented. New landing craft were designed and built. Amphibious doctrine was revised. Pre-assault reconnaissance was expanded. Naval gunfire support was recalibrated. By the time American forces assaulted the next string of atolls in the Marshall Islands, they were equipped and trained in a way that Tarawa had made absolutely necessary. For the Japanese, Tarawa represented something else, a confirmation of the doctrine they had embraced. The garrison had not won. Indeed, it had been destroyed. But it had inflicted such a terrible cost that American commanders would have to think carefully about every subsequent operation. The message that the Japanese garrison's sacrifice conveyed to military planners in Tokyo was perhaps more dangerous than any victory could have been, that the Americans, for all their industrial capacity and their logistical reach, could be made to bleed, that the Pacific was not an open road for conquest, but a series of fortified positions that could each extract a price measured in thousands of lives. This belief would drive Japanese military planning in the final 2 years of the war, leading to the construction of ever deeper fortifications, ever larger garrisons, and a commitment to fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa with exactly the same philosophy that had made Tarawa such a slaughterhouse. The men who died on the reef at Tarawa, both Japanese and American, had paid for an education that the war would still require the living to complete at greater and greater cost. The 76 hours at Tarawa represented a threshold crossed. Behind it lay a Pacific War that American planners had imagined would be solved by superior firepower and logistical advantage. Ahead of it lay a different kind of war, one in which every island would have to be conquered yard by yard, one in which Japanese defenders would offer nothing but their lives in trade, and one in which American casualties would accumulate to levels that would test the nation's willingness to see the war through to the end. The battle had shocked the American public, but had also transformed the American military's understanding of what victory would require. In that strange alchemy of warfare, total Japanese defeat at Tarawa had produced an American triumph that came only at a cost that made the victory hollow, and had purchased a set of lessons that would shape every subsequent operation in the Pacific. The Coral Atoll had been captured, but the price, written on the reef, would never be forgotten. When the survivors of Betio Island stumbled back onto the transports in late November of 1943, they carried with them not merely wounds and trauma, but a message that would reshape the entire American war machine. The photographs came ashore first. Grainy images of men twisted across a coral reef, of landing craft torn apart by artillery fire, of a beach so densely packed with bodies that the living could barely find space to dig fighting positions. The American casualty count shocked the nation. Nearly 1,000 men killed and over 2,000 wounded in 76 hours of combat on an island so small that a man could walk across it in 20 minutes. For the first time in the Pacific War, the cost of amphibious assault had become so visibly terrible that it could no longer be absorbed in silence by military planners or hidden from the American public watching the newsreels in darkened cinemas. Tarawa had been a victory, yes. The island was taken, the Japanese garrison annihilated. But it was a victory purchased at a price that sent shockwaves through every level of American command, from the Pentagon to the fleet anchorages to the headquarters of the Marine Corps itself. The fundamental problem that Tarawa exposed was not one of courage or determination, but of doctrine and machinery. The American assault had relied on a methodology, refined through amphibious operations in North Africa and Sicily, a method that assumed adequate naval bombardment would suppress enemy defenses, that men could cross a reef on foot if necessary, that speed and the sheer weight of American firepower would overwhelm resistance. But Betio Island had been fortified beyond anything the planners had truly anticipated. Bunkers layered with concrete and coconut log beams, impervious to naval gunfire, machine gun positions sited to rake the beaches, artillery pre-ranged and ready, the entire beach a geometrically perfect killing field, designed by men who had studied American tactics and specifically engineered their defenses to maximize American casualties. The coral reef itself, which American planners had underestimated as a minor obstacle, proved catastrophic. The landing craft could not navigate it, leaving thousands of men to wade ashore across open water in the teeth of Japanese fire, moving at the speed of men walking through waist-deep water, utterly vulnerable. The naval bombardment, which had lasted only 2 days, had failed to suppress the most critical defenses. The concrete structures had simply absorbed the punishment, and the Japanese defenders had emerged from shelters to man their weapons. When the initial waves of Marines hit the beach, they found themselves funneled by the reef geometry into predetermined fire zones, unable to take cover, unable to maneuver, simply forced to push forward or die where they stood. In the weeks that followed, a systematic examination of what had gone wrong began in earnest. The United States Navy and Marine Corps convened investigative boards, interviewed survivors, studied the after-action reports with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The conclusions were stark. The existing amphibious doctrine was fundamentally flawed and would result in unacceptable casualties if applied to the next major operation without radical modification. The Navy's gunfire support doctrine required complete rethinking. The two-day bombardment was simply insufficient to neutralize modern fortified positions, and the timing and intensity of fire support needed to be dramatically increased. The landing craft themselves were inadequate for the new reality. The flat-bottomed Higgins boats that had served in previous operations were vulnerable and unreliable in rough water, and there needed to be specialized vessels capable of crossing reefs and delivering fire support directly to the beaches. The pre-landing reconnaissance was too sparse and imprecise. Commanders were making decisions about assault timing and sector allocation based on outdated or incomplete information about reef conditions, beach gradients, and the precise location of enemy defenses. The underwater obstacles that had so devastated the assault had come as a surprise. Despite their presence being predictable, no formal underwater demolition capability existed to clear beaches before the main assault, and this gap needed to be closed with trained teams, specialized equipment, and rehearsed procedures. Out of this reckoning emerged a series of cascading innovations that would, over the course of the next year, fundamentally transform American amphibious capability. The Navy began deploying specialized landing ships and craft designed specifically to navigate coral reefs and provide direct gunfire support from shallow water. Vessels like the LSM, the LCS, and eventually the famous alligator and crocodile amphibious vehicles that could negotiate terrain that had previously been impassable obstacles. The naval gunfire support doctrine was completely overhauled. Future bombardments would last not 2 days, but a week or longer, with far heavier concentrations of fire, with precise targeting of known and suspected enemy positions, with the possibility of calling down fire during the assault itself from dedicated naval gunfire liaison officers ashore with the assault troops. The United States Navy pioneered the formal organization of Naval Combat Demolition Units, small teams of specially trained sailors who would go ashore before the main assault, locate and destroy underwater obstacles, and prepare the beaches for the waves of landing craft that would follow. These units, initially ad hoc and improvised, would eventually be formalized into the naval demolition teams, and eventually, after the war, into the legendary SEAL teams that would define American special operations for generations to come. The reconnaissance capabilities were dramatically expanded. Reconnaissance planes flew over target beaches with increasingly sophisticated cameras. Detailed maps were prepared. Officers conducted small-scale landing exercises to study beach conditions and enemy positions before committing entire divisions to combat. Perhaps most significantly, the United States undertook a complete reorganization of the way amphibious assaults were planned and coordinated. The seemingly simple problem of the reef at Tarawa, which had caught everyone by surprise despite its existence being known, revealed a deeper organizational failure. There was no systematic process for translating intelligence about coastal geography into operational planning, no established routine for briefing assault commanders on the practical implications of reef conditions, no formal doctrine for what to do when the standard landing craft could not reach the shore. In response, the Navy and Marine Corps created new staff procedures, new intelligence sections dedicated specifically to amphibious planning, new doctrinal publications that codified lessons learned. The commanders who had faced Tarawa, including General Julian Smith and Colonel David Shoup, became advocates for these changes and worked tirelessly to ensure that every lesson purchased in blood was implemented before the next assault. The very highest levels of command, including Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, made it clear that no operation would proceed until the lessons of Tarawa had been absorbed and applied, and this mandate from the top meant that institutional resistance to change was minimal. Yet, while the Americans were engaged in this systematic redesign of their amphibious machinery, the Japanese were studying Tarawa with their own mixture of shock and interpretative disagreement. The loss of Betio had been catastrophic. Over 4,000 men killed, only a handful taken prisoner, the entire garrison annihilated, and Japanese commanders could not simply ignore a defeat of such magnitude. The question that consumed Japanese military analysis was whether the waterline defense doctrine that had been the cornerstone of island garrison strategy had fundamentally failed, or whether it had simply been overwhelmed by American firepower that was quantitatively and qualitatively beyond what Japanese planners had anticipated. The prevailing interpretation, particularly among senior naval commanders, was the latter. The doctrine was sound, but Tarawa had been a special case, a heavily fortified atoll that had absorbed enormous punishment and had cost the Americans dearly. This was how a waterline defense was supposed to work. The problem, from this perspective, was not the doctrine itself, but the need to fortify even more heavily, to ensure that every atoll in the Central Pacific had been strengthened to the point where an American assault would be bleeding and desperate, and ultimately stopped. Japanese commanders scrutinized the American performance at Tarawa and saw evidence to support their interpretation. The American casualties had been extraordinarily high, close to a quarter of the assault force, rates of loss that would have been politically unsustainable if inflicted repeatedly. But a contrary analysis was also beginning to circulate, particularly among officers who had studied the actual tactical details of how Betio had been assaulted and overwhelmed. These officers recognized that the American landing had succeeded despite the fearful cost, that the assault waves had been replaced by subsequent waves, that American firepower, even with imperfect accuracy, had eventually suppressed the Japanese defenses sufficiently to allow the infantry to advance. More troubling still, these analysts recognized that the American naval bombardment was only going to improve, that the reconnaissance methods would become more sophisticated, that the scale of assault forces would increase, and that the Americans appeared capable of learning from their mistakes with remarkable speed. The American ability to study a battle, identify problems, manufacture new equipment, or develop new procedures, and implement those changes within months, was something that Japanese military industry could simply not match. Where the Americans could commission new landing craft by the hundreds and equip naval demolition teams with specialized gear, the Japanese were struggling to maintain production levels of conventional weapons and equipment, let alone develop entirely new categories of amphibious assault gear. The deeper structural problem, that Japan had already committed its industrial capacity to building fleet carriers and capital ships and conventional landing craft to support a now impossible strategic vision, meant that the response to Tarawa would inevitably be reactive and incomplete. In January of 1944, several weeks after Tarawa had fallen, the Japanese Navy issued a revised directive for island garrison forces. The directive acknowledged that greater fortification would be necessary and ordered the acceleration of defensive construction across the entire Central Pacific atoll chain. The directive also, somewhat obliquely, suggested that garrisons should be prepared for assaults of greater scale and sophistication than had been assumed in previous planning, and that local commanders should maintain greater flexibility in their defensive responses. This language, which appears vague and non-committal when read carefully, actually represented a significant shift. It was an admission that the waterline defense doctrine was insufficient, that pure concentration of force at the beach was no longer the answer, and that some retreat into the interior of islands to prepared secondary positions might be necessary. Yet the resources available to implement this revised doctrine were limited, and many commanding officers continued to believe that defense at the waterline remained the optimal strategy. The institutional memory of Japanese military success from 1941 to 1942, the rapid victories, the overwhelming force, the enemy always retreating, created a powerful psychological weight that made it difficult for officers to accept that fundamentally different defensive approaches might be necessary. The technological gap between Japanese responses and American innovations became starkly apparent in the next major American operations. When the assault on the Marshall Islands began in early 1944, the American fleet included new classes of ships, new landing craft, significantly upgraded naval gunfire support, and the first fully trained naval demolition teams to clear beaches. The bombardment of the Marshall Islands lasted days longer than previous operations, with far greater concentrations of firepower, with multiple passes by naval guns, with measured and deliberate destruction of known targets. The beach reconnaissance was precise and detailed. American commanders knew not just where the beaches were, but what the underwater approaches looked like, where the hazards lay, what the gradient of the shore was, where the enemy fortifications had been positioned. The assault waves were supported by a far greater number of specialized gunfire support vessels, capable of standing close to shore and suppressing enemy fire during the critical moments of landing. Within days of the assault beginning, American forces had captured Kwajalein with casualties that were dramatically lower, proportionally, than those suffered at Tarawa, despite facing similar, or in some cases stronger, enemy positions. The strategic implications were not lost on Japanese commanders. What had cost the Americans 1,000 lives and 2,000 wounded on a single atoll in November of 1943 now cost fewer casualties, even as American assault forces grew larger and more capable. Yet even as American amphibious capability was accelerating, the resources that the Americans were able to deploy were themselves undergoing multiplication. The vast American shipbuilding program, which had produced hundreds of landing craft in 1943, was stepping up production further in 1944. The United States was literally able to build enough landing craft and assault transports to conduct multiple large-scale amphibious operations simultaneously across the Pacific, while maintaining operations in Europe and the Atlantic as well. This was a capacity that Japan simply could not match. While the Americans were building landing craft by the hundreds, Japan's entire annual production of specialized amphibious assault vessels numbered in the dozens. The American ability to absorb casualties and maintain offensive momentum, to learn from defeats and implement improvements at industrial scale, meant that every lesson of Tarawa would be applied not to one subsequent operation, but to dozens of them, in endless variation across the remaining islands of the Pacific. For the Japanese, the period after Tarawa became one of increasingly desperate adaptation. The understanding that the waterline defense doctrine was insufficient finally penetrated even the most resistant headquarters by the time the marshals were falling. Surviving commanders began to advocate for a different approach. Rather than fighting entirely at the beach, garrisons should construct layered defenses that permitted a measured withdrawal into the island interior, trading ground for time, making the Americans pay for every meter of advance. Bunkers should be sited not in a single belt at the waterline, but at multiple depths, creating killing zones that forced attackers to assault through successive defensive positions. Cave networks should be expanded and connected, allowing defenders to survive naval bombardment by taking shelter deep underground, then emerging to man weapons when American infantry approached. Artillery should be distributed and hidden, fired from prepared positions, and then moved before counter-battery fire could silence them. This philosophy, defense in depth, would eventually culminate in the monstrous effectiveness of Japanese defensive doctrine on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but it represented a radical departure from the waterline methodology that had dominated Japanese thinking since 1942. The twin processes of American amphibious revolution and Japanese defensive adaptation would define every major operation for the remainder of the Pacific War. The Americans would become progressively more sophisticated and effective, while the Japanese would become progressively more desperate and tactically clever in response. Tarawa had been the crucible in which these twin trajectories began. The American trajectory toward dominating amphibious assault, and the Japanese trajectory toward making every island as costly as possible, despite the knowledge that victory was no longer possible. The light that illuminated this transformation was purchased in blood, in the bodies of nearly 3,000 American casualties on a coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of. That price, terrible though it was, would prove to be an investment. The lessons learned at Tarawa would be applied and refined across the remaining Pacific campaigns, reducing the casualty rate per island seized and accelerating the American advance toward Japan. But the price paid by those who fell on Betio was never forgotten. In the memorials, in the histories, in the conscience of a nation that had learned through bitter experience that victory in modern warfare required not just courage and sacrifice, but constant innovation and the willingness to fundamentally reimagine the methods by which goals were pursued. The lessons of Tarawa had been written in blood, and the United States Marine Corps had learned them with terrible clarity. Through the winter and early spring of 1944, American amphibious doctrine transformed. New landing craft emerged from shipyards, purpose-built to cross coral reefs and deliver men directly onto beaches, rather than leaving them to wade through waist-deep water under machine gun fire. Underwater demolition teams trained to approach islands under cover of darkness and chart safe passages through reef obstacles, marking channels and detonating concrete obstacles so that incoming waves could pass unimpeded. Naval gunfire support became more sophisticated, with spotters embedded with assault units and fire coordination perfected to levels the Japanese had not anticipated. The speed of American movement accelerated. Supply lines, once stretched and vulnerable, grew more secure with each new advance. The machinery of the American war in the Pacific was no longer improvising. It was executing, and it was doing so with overwhelming force. By February of 1944, that machine turned its attention toward the Marshall Islands, two parallel chains of coral atolls, lying roughly 2,400 kilometers northeast of Guadalcanal, sitting like a broken necklace, strewn across 1,000 kilometers of open ocean. The Marshalls represented something crucial in Japan's defensive strategy, the outer rampart of what military planners called the defensive perimeter, the intended fortress that would bleed American resources and buy time for the homeland to prepare for invasion. The Japanese Navy and Army had invested heavily in the island's fortification. Seabees, the American Naval Construction Battalions, had worked miracles in building forward bases, but the Japanese had been at similar work for months, and they believed their preparations were sufficient. At Kwajalein Atoll, the largest in the archipelago, the Japanese army had stationed a garrison that grew to nearly 9,000 strong. The island itself was a thin strip of coral, barely 3 kilometers long and less than a kilometer wide, but the Japanese had transformed it into a fortress that bristled with artillery and anti-tank guns. The adjacent islands of Roya and Namur held additional garrisons and naval air bases. Enuetok Atoll, deeper within the chain and farther west, had also been reinforced and fortified. Smaller atolls throughout the group held smaller garrisons, hundreds of troops each, enough to resist, enough to make the Americans pay. Yet even as the Japanese commanders surveyed these preparations and calculated that they had done what they could, they faced a problem that no amount of concrete and steel could overcome. The Americans were not attacking just one island this time. The American invasion force that departed Majuro Lagoon on the 29th of January 1944 was a fleet so vast that it seemed to occupy the horizon itself. Escort carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, minesweepers, transports, and landing craft stretched across dozens of kilometers of ocean. The assault force itself comprised the 1st and 4th Marine Divisions, elements of the 22nd Marine Regiment, and supporting army units. More than 30,000 combat troops. The bombardment that began on the 30th of January dwarfed anything the Japanese defenders had experienced. Battleships and cruisers opened fire from positions miles offshore, raining shells across the islands for hours. Aircraft from escort carriers swept overhead, dropping bombs and strafing positions. Underwater demolition teams swam toward Kwajalein and the surrounding islands, placing charges on obstacles and marking safe passages. The Japanese defenders returned fire as best they could, but their anti-aircraft positions were overwhelmed, and their artillery, stationed as it was to defend against a waterline assault, found itself outranged and outmassed. By the time the assault waves began moving toward the beach on the 1st of February, Kwajalein had been pummeled relentlessly. The airfield was cratered and useless. Bunkers that had seemed so formidable on paper were collapsed or buried under coral sand. The Selef and army personnel in the fortifications were shell-shocked, exhausted, and facing an impossible task: hold this tiny island against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1 and had complete command of sea and air. The assault troops hit the beaches at dawn on the 1st of February, and the American system that Tarawa's survivors had helped to design functioned smoothly. The new landing craft deposited men directly onto the beach in assault waves. Subsequent waves brought tanks, artillery, and supplies without the hideous delay that had plagued earlier operations. Engineers quickly cleared obstacles while infantry pressed inland. The Japanese garrison put up fierce resistance in pockets. An anti-tank gun would suddenly open fire from a hidden bunker, and the Americans would call in naval gunfire or tank support to obliterate it. Bayonet charges by isolated groups of defenders inflicted casualties, but were ultimately futile against coordinated firepower. By the end of the 2nd day of February, organized Japanese resistance on Kwajalein had essentially collapsed. The defenders had been overwhelmed not by superior courage or determination, but by the sheer weight of American firepower delivered with precision and speed. Nearly all of the 9,000 Japanese troops on Kwajalein and the surrounding islands were killed. Only a handful were captured alive. The speed of the island's fall shocked both American commanders and Japanese observers. Where Tarawa had taken 76 hours of bitter fighting to secure, Kwajalein fell in less than 2 days. The difference was not Japanese weakness. The defenders had fought with characteristic ferocity and disregard for their own survival. The difference was that the Americans had learned the lessons that Tarawa had taught them, and had built a system to overwhelm island garrisons with a speed and coordination that made even the most elaborate Japanese defenses obsolete. Roya and Namur, the airfield islands adjacent to Kwajalein, fell in parallel assaults that same week, defended by smaller garrisons, that were nevertheless annihilated in fighting, that produced the familiar pattern of American overwhelming force meeting Japanese resistance to the last man. The fall of the Kwajalein Atoll was not the end of the Marshall Islands campaign. American forces next turned their attention westward to Eniwetok Atoll, nearly 200 kilometers farther along the chain. The assault force was smaller, 2 reinforced regiments instead of 2 full divisions, but the principle remained unchanged: bombardment from sea and air, assault landings by coordinated waves under cover of supporting fire, rapid consolidation of the beachhead, and relentless pressure inland until all organized resistance ceased. The garrisons at Eniwetok, numbering around 3,000 troops, held out for several days of desperate fighting. Bunkers were defended until they were buried or set on fire. Japanese counterattacks, mounted at night by troops who had no thought of surrender, resulted in heavy American casualties. But the outcome was never in doubt. By the 5th of February, American flags were flying over the islands of Eniwetok. The casualty figures told a story that Japanese commanders could not ignore. Out of the more than 12,000 Japanese troops stationed in the Marshall Islands when the American assault began, fewer than 300 survived to become prisoners of war. American casualties, while significant, were orders of magnitude lower, and the speed with which the campaign had concluded meant that the losses suffered had been inflicted in just days. At Tarawa, American forces had absorbed horrific casualties to eliminate a garrison of approximately 4,000 troops. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, combined American casualties were lower, despite the fact that Japanese garrisons were more numerous and, in some cases, more heavily fortified. The mathematical equation had shifted decisively. Japan's defensive perimeter had been breached. The outer fortress had fallen, and it had fallen faster than Japan's high command believed possible. Messages from island commanders before their deaths told a story of American firepower so overwhelming that no system of fortifications could withstand it for more than a few days. The lesson was clear, though few in Japan's military leadership were willing to fully acknowledge it. The war had entered a phase in which the primary question was no longer whether the Americans could be stopped, but where and how they might be slowed. The Marshall Islands campaign had exposed another critical weakness in Japanese strategy. The islands were simply too far from the Japanese homeland and too dependent on naval support to be reinforced or resupplied once American forces had established superiority. Japan's merchant fleet was dying, sunk by American submarines and air attacks, faster than new ships could replace the losses. Supplies and reinforcements that might have reached the islands in 1942 or early 1943 now faced nearly impossible odds of arriving safely. The Japanese defenders were largely fighting with pre-positioned supplies, and those supplies were not unlimited. Once American forces landed, the islands were written off as lost. There would be no relief column. There would be no reinforcement. There would be only fight and die. The psychological impact of the Marshall Islands campaign extended beyond the islands themselves. American forward bases now moved inexorably closer to Japan's inner defensive ring, which centered on the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, roughly 400 kilometers farther west. These islands held greater strategic significance than the Marshalls. Their loss would bring American bombers, and eventually American forces, within striking range of the home islands themselves. Moreover, the Marianas were defended not just by isolated garrisons, but by substantial combined Japanese Army and Navy forces. If Kwajalein and Eniwetok could fall in days, despite careful preparation, what did that mean for Saipan? What did that mean for the defense of Japan itself? The accelerating tide was no longer a theoretical concern. It was advancing across the Pacific in landing craft and amphibious assault vessels. moving faster than anyone in Tokyo had dared imagine, and leaving in its wake a trail of lost garrisons and islands that had cost men's lives but could not be held against the weight of American firepower. The Japanese High Command faced a terrible mathematics. They could reinforce the inner islands and hope to slow the American advance, but reinforcements meant ships leaving port, and ships leaving port were increasingly vulnerable to attack. They could fortify the islands even more heavily, but fortifications required supplies delivered by those same vulnerable ships. The system was beginning to break. The SNLF units that survived the Marshall Islands campaign, and there were pitifully few, retreated deeper into the perimeter, either being transferred to the Marianas or being assigned to smaller, more peripheral islands to buy time for the inner defenses to be strengthened. The force that had swept so confidently through the Pacific just 2 years earlier was now in the position of defending islands it could not reinforce and battles it could not win. Yet the men who wore the Naval Landing Force uniform understood their role. They would hold the islands. They would fight to the last man. They would make the enemy pay a price for every kilometer of advance. And when their islands fell, and all of them knew now that they would fall, they would die as warriors, not as defeated soldiers. The Marshall Islands had shown what that would cost the Americans. The islands yet to come would show it again and again, in ever-mounting numbers of American casualties and ever-accelerating losses of Japanese garrisons who fought knowing that their sacrifice was merely delaying an advance that could not be stopped. By the summer of 1944, the American tide in the Pacific had become something that could no longer be stopped, only endured. The conquest of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands had torn away Japan's outermost defenses and taught American commanders lessons written in the blood of thousands of their own men. The amphibious machine that the United States had refined through trial and catastrophe was now moving westward with terrifying momentum, and its next objective lay in the Mariana Islands, a chain of volcanic peaks and coral atolls that formed a crucial link in the remaining defensive architecture of the Japanese Empire. These islands, particularly Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, represented something far more consequential than distant specks on a map. They were the final barrier between the American war machine and the inner sanctum of Japanese power itself. With the Marianas in American hands, long-range bombers would sit within striking distance of the home islands, and everyone in Tokyo understood that this was a threshold that could not be permitted to fall. The Japanese High Command had watched the collapse of the Marshalls with cold clarity. They knew now that the waterline defense doctrine, that rigid insistence on meeting the enemy at the beach and throwing him back into the sea, had failed repeatedly, catastrophically, across a dozen island battles. Yet the Marianas presented a different kind of problem. Unlike the flat coral atolls of the Gilberts and Marshalls, Saipan and its neighbors rose in steep, thickly jungled volcanic slopes that offered genuine possibilities for defense in depth. The Japanese Army and Navy commanders, tasked with holding these islands, possessed more time, more resources, and more manpower than had been available for any previous Pacific garrison. Roughly 50,000 troops were committed to the defense of Saipan alone, a mixture of ground forces, special naval landing force units, Navy base personnel, and support troops. This was no skeleton garrison. This was meant to be a fortress. Yet beneath the surface confidence, there was also a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. The Americans were not merely strong anymore, they were overwhelming. The naval and air dimensions of the coming battle were sketched out in the desperate calculations of Japanese commanders in early 1944. The Mobile fleet, now desperately weakened by losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and countless carrier battles, was being positioned to contest the invasion. On the 19th of June, 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft and American planes met in the Philippine Sea in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a one-sided aerial massacre in which American pilots, flying superior aircraft with superior training, destroyed hundreds of Japanese planes and killed hundreds of experienced Japanese naval aviators in a single day of combat. The Japanese carriers were crippled and driven from the field. Japanese naval power in the Pacific, which had seemed invincible just 2.5 years before, was finished. No relief fleet would come to rescue the garrisons on Saipan. No naval counteroffensive would strike the American beachhead. The defenders of the Marianas would fight alone, and they would die alone, and every Japanese soldier and officer on those islands knew it, even as the battle began. The American landings on Saipan commenced on the 15th of June, 1944, along beaches on the western side of the island, where Special Naval Landing Force troops and Army infantry had prepared their defenses for weeks. The bombardment that preceded the landing was the most massive yet delivered by the Pacific Fleet. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured fire into the island's heights with a fury that should have pulverized everything in its path. Yet, as the American Marines waded ashore and pressed inland, they encountered resistance that was not broken, but rather transformed. The Japanese defenders, having learned hard lessons on Peleliu and Iwo Jima, had pushed much of their strength back from the beaches into carefully prepared positions in the interior, cave systems, tunneled ridges, prepared strongpoints sited to deliver interlocking fields of fire across the invasion beaches and the interior approaches. The Japanese command structure on Saipan was unified under General Yoshitsugu Saito, an army officer, but the Special Naval Landing Force units under his command functioned as shock troops and fortress troops, men who were trained to hold terrain at any cost and to contest every meter of ground with suicidal determination. The battle for Saipan unfolded across roughly 3 weeks of grinding, brutal fighting that demonstrated in the starkest possible terms the true nature of the war that Japan had brought upon itself. The American advance was methodical and overwhelming. Artillery, air support, and armor pushed the Japanese defenders backward toward the northern end of the island as the American beachhead expanded and their supply lines solidified. Yet the pace of advance was purchased at terrible cost. Japanese defensive positions were often prepared with such care and such density of firepower that American platoons and companies were shattered trying to assault them. Counterattacks, some ordered by Japanese command, and others rising spontaneously from unit leaders, desperate to drive the Americans back, threw waves of Japanese soldiers against American positions that were fortified, supplied, and supported by overwhelming firepower. Casualties on both sides mounted into the tens of thousands. The American Marines and soldiers who were landing were not green troops anymore. They had fought on islands before, but the scale of resistance on Saipan exceeded anything most of them had encountered. This was a true siege in miniature, with all the protracted slaughter that sieges entail. But the deepest tragedy of Saipan, and the event that would resonate through Japanese military command and Japanese society with overwhelming force, was not primarily the death of soldiers. As the American advance continued, and the Japanese perimeter contracted toward the northern tip of the island, thousands of Saipan's civilian population, perhaps 8,000, perhaps more, became trapped in the final pockets of Japanese-held territory. Trapped and then induced or coerced through a combination of Japanese propaganda about American savagery and the direct orders of Japanese officers to end their own lives rather than surrender to the Americans. In the final days of June 1944, families hurled themselves from cliffs into the sea, Mothers drowned their children. Civilians were shot by Japanese soldiers who would not permit them to surrender. The cliff that would become known as Suicide Cliff witnessed a horror almost unimaginable in its scale and tragedy. This was not military combat anymore. This was something darker. The collision